Fullmetal Alchemist is freaking sneaky, okay? Oh, let's do some lighthearted adventure for the first 4 chapters and then... Are my emotions a joke to you? This chapter has left a void in my soul, and the only thing that can fill it is more of this incredible story. But I'm getting a little ahead of myself, so let's take a step back. When I grew up, I spent a lot of time watching Dragon Ball and not a lot of time watching anything else. And over the last 3 years, I've tried to fix that by covering some of the most respected, crazy, traumatic, and popular manga in circulation today. However, I've not yet come across anything quite like this before. Fullmetal Alchemist is a story that since its completion in 2010 has been widely praised as perfect. And in addition to you guys asking for it every single day for the last 3 years straight, this story has also featured as the #1 anime on many high-profile lists across the web. Which means for the next 3 videos I will be, for the very first time, trying to figure out if it's deserving of this praise. Reading and sharing my first impressions of Hiromu Arakawa's sneaky and deeply upsetting supposed masterpiece,
Fullmetal Alchemist.
Take a seat, everyone. This should be fun. Alright, so like I said, the first 5 chapters of the story took me completely by surprise, and just for transparency, I'm going to be writing sections of this as I read them. I have no idea what happens after chapter 5 yet, but I figured I'd let you all know what I thought about the first 5 chapters because it was a really interesting bait and switch to me. And by interesting, I mean sick and twisted, but I digress. This manga has the strongest first page I've ever read. It illustrates the singular event that kickstarts this entire story, all the while interweaving the core message of it. In just 1 page and 4 panels, Arikawa tells a story of catastrophe, realization, despair, and consequence, the likes of which I've never seen so concisely conveyed before. I've read a lot of manga on this channel, some truly great pieces of storytelling. However, when I tell you all that this is the single strongest first page I've read, I want to emphasize that fact as true. For example, I got chills when I read this line: "For humankind cannot gain anything without first giving something up in return." Beyond this, the first 4 chapters are largely centered around standalone stories that we as readers believe to be unrelated to one another at this point in time. They involve our 2 main characters, Edward Elric and his younger brother Alphonse, as they travel in search of something called the Philosopher's Stone to right the wrongs of their past. The first chapter contends with the antics of one self-appointed religious figure known as Father Cornello, one who claims he can raise the dead, to which Edward says, "Don't like the sound of that." Now, that's subtle, but it's a really nice piece of exposition expressed through character expression. It suggests Edward's negative experience with such a venture, and it just really makes me want to lean in and learn more about this world. I think what I love about this manga also is that for these first 4 chapters or so, it tries to hide the horror of this world for the most part behind humorous artwork and some truly great storytelling. But at the end of the day, the true nature of this story always manages to seep through the cracks. In chapter 1, a young woman called Rose wishes for Father Cornello to resurrect her deceased boyfriend. It's very heavy subject matter, certainly not what I expected from a first chapter, but what follows again alludes to something more harrowing in Edward and Al's pasts, one that could explain their physical state presently. Furthermore, there's some godlike comparisons used here also, but not in the way that you'd expect. The comparison is made between Edward and Icarus, who famously failed at his mission despite his greatest and most ambitious efforts to reach the heavens above. Furthermore, the story contained in chapter 1 is sort of perfect in its placing. Much like the townsfolk, we the readers don't know of alchemy and how it's used, and once we see what Father Cornello can do, we accept that there must be some legitimacy to his claims of divinity. And what bonds us with Edward and Alphonse from the get-go is their lifting of the cloak on this conman and his hoax on this town. There are of course other stories like the mining one in chapter 3, which paints this world in dirty shades of grey, the government being the antagonists in this instance. It seems that everyone in this world is fair game if their motives are misplaced, which honestly just makes things that much more interesting to me. But no matter what, I keep returning to the conclusion of chapter 2. It's explained to us that equivalent exchange is the rule with which this story abides by, that in order to gain one thing, something of equal value must be offered up in return. I mention this because the one rule of this world sort of defines these 2 boys and their journey, Ed and Al, or more specifically Edward. The character Arikawa writes spectacularly well.
前へ進め。あんたには立派な足がついてるじゃないか。
To show you what I mean, there are two quotes I want to examine. And the first is from this exchange between Rose and Edward. Now disillusioned following Cornello's exposure, she's emotionally unable to let her boyfriend go, having held on to hope for so long, only to be let down at the very end. What Edward says to her in response to this begging can come off as cold, but speaks to the harsh reality of this world and the reality he's lived within alongside his brother all this time, saying that she has to figure out what her next step is alone. To stand up and walk, and unlike them, Edward and Al, she has at least strong legs to take her to where she needs to go, suggesting that Edward believes she got off easier than he did. The second quote I want to draw attention to is a blink and you miss it quip. In chapter 4, while on the train, Edward says to Al that you can't move forward if you keep regretting the past. This line is played for laughs quite obviously in this scene, but even in the comedy of this manga resides the DNA of these characters, because this philosophy speaks to the type of person Edward is. He's quick to certain provocations, hands-on and resourceful, someone who thinks he always has an answer. And when things go wrong, he moves on with conviction, trying to do his best to make amends moving forward. For without that mindset, he'll forever get nothing done and fixate on the past. These 4 chapters are quite lighthearted in parts, but again are permeated by seemingly innocuous levels of darkness. That is until we get to chapter 5. Yeah, okay, we get the picture. This episode is fucked with a capital F. Where all the other chapters had darkness in their background, with this, it's the very literal subject matter. When the 2 boys arrive from their eventful trip, their focus is squarely on bioalchemy, or more specifically to seek it out, to which they are pointed in the direction of one Sho Tucker. He's introduced as the Sowing Life Alchemist for having, at one point 2 years ago, created a chimera, a fusion of 2 or more creatures that could talk. And that isn't even remotely the most screwed up thing in this chapter. Not by a long shot, and I think that's sort of the idea. The purpose of these first 5 chapters are to establish the main duo, reveal how moral they are, and in the background allude to something far more severe and dark. I'm not even kind of exaggerating that when it was revealed that Sho Tucker sacrificed his wife,
his dog,
and his daughter for the sake of his work, this manga evoked a fear deep within me, the likes of which I never even got from Berserk. And I think it has to do with what these 5 chapters do best. Establish a precedent and then boom, contrast. And from this point on, as readers and viewers, we experience this story through the lens of this event and the horror that befell these boys. It's very happy-go-lucky, but it's grounded in its approach, and through that every little detail becomes that much more emphatic, for lack of a better term. The near misses become extremely tense, and the deaths, well, they hit much harder too. So it's right around here we leave the tutorial area of the story and everything really starts to open up to us. We learn about the politics and the history of a group known as the Ishvalans. We learn more about gluttony, envy, and lust, and what's more is we get to see some really clever animation. It's not flashy or anything, but when Scar shatters Edward's arm, Ed moves to crawl backwards, but falls because he's missing his arm. It's a very small detail, but it's one that I appreciate greatly. It's great character acting. But back on the topic of context and setting, generally speaking, this isn't so much a story with clear-cut sides. We've been bonded to many in the military, like Mustang, Armstrong, and Hawkeye, among others, but we can also sympathize with what's going on with the Ishvalan, formerly known as Scar. And moreover, the trio of glut, lust, and envy seem to be against him too. But yeah, that's all I got for now. Time to go back to reading.
5 hours later.
Alright, I'm after reading a bunch more, and there's a mystery afoot, everyone. And we meet a girl called Winry that has such a cool design with her jumpsuit, and then a really nice guy dies. My head hurts. Alright, let's get into it. Things might seem complex right now, but it kind of isn't. Which is interesting because this story doesn't really pack itself full with information, at least not in any obvious way, and I think that's perhaps the most clever thing about this story that I've observed so far. From this point on, there's a lot of mystery surrounding a supposedly evil plot and its connection to the Philosopher's Stone that Ed and Al are searching for, and with all of that on my dinner plate, I never felt too full or overwhelmed by the exposition. Yeah! When I was reading One Piece week to week, I would be writing up like 20-page documents of notes, taking account of everything that I thought would be relevant and worth addressing in a video, while also slamming like 6 to 9 volumes every 4 days in a sweat. One Piece, it's intense. It's not for the faint of heart. Only those with the strength and will to become the Pirate King, that is. But with Fullmetal Alchemist, I feel so much more relaxed. This is one long, continuous story, and Arakawa is interested in telling it at her own pace, and honestly, it's phenomenal. She has such a keen eye for picking out certain intimate moments and creates space for us to bathe in them for a little while longer than other stories I've read through have given me. And this creates so much more natural investment for me as a reader because I want so desperately for these characters that I am now invested in to get their happy endings. Where Dragon Ball would be way too busy shoving in some fight scene, or in the case of One Piece, would be way too busy shoving in as much story as possible, it's a good thing.
Please don't kill the One Piece community.
Fullmetal Alchemist, I am happy to say, has a wonderful balance of the two and has struck a very satisfying approach for me, I think. But enough generalities. I alluded to a mystery element within this story. The Philosopher's Stone and its supposed connection with the plot Lust & Co. are carrying out. On their way to Winry for repairs, Ed and Al stop to talk to one Dr. Marco, whose research is directly tied to what Ed and Al are desperately looking for. This is where the mystery is turned up to 11. He uses a Philosopher's Stone and is known all around the area as a guy that can just heal people with miracles, so to speak. But the conflict here is that Dr. Marco doesn't give Ed anything other than a riddle to solve, and that is to find the truth that lies within the truth. What the hell does that mean? Ed and Al are now faced with solving this mystery, this riddle that leads to the next step in this web of confusion, and someone is hiding something, but what is it? Suddenly the story has gone full-blown mystery noir and I am all here for it. It's such a rare atmosphere for a shonen manga to try and employ so successfully. Anyways, that riddle meant that the government, I think, were using prisoners as sacrifices to create more Philosopher's Stones. For what reason? I still don't know, but this is how far we are. Al and Ed go to investigate, but are cut off before they can discover anything by 2 souls. Well, okay, technically 3 souls, but they're all trapped in 2 suits of armor. They both beat their attackers, and just as Ed's dude is about to spill the beans... This story is screwed up. Despite his meddling, despite his looking for the truth, for some reason they let Edward live. Why? What's the significance? What's happening? Okay, jokes aside, I do have a theory, but you're gonna have to wait a teeny bit longer.
Fullmetal Alchemist.
When I first saw this Hughes guy, I was primed to hate him. I was entrenched in my big brain mode of constantly trying to suss out and analyze who the secret bad guy might be. This series definitely has one somewhere, and Hughes was too nice. He loved his family, perhaps too much. That could be motive, right? Well, it turns out he's actually awesome and one of the coolest characters in the series. He gave Winry a place to stay when she was repairing Ed's arm after the Lab 5 fight, and he even manages to deliver one of the most tense scenes in the series. This is another moment where Fullmetal Alchemist turns the drama up to 10 and we are all drawn in. Reading through this segment of the manga, I was immediately convinced of Hughes' innocence and was on his side 1,000,000%. Knowing full well that things were likely going to go south for the character, he found some key information that blows this whole case wide open, and that's the problem. But he escapes like a mad lad! Losing a lot of blood, but in the depths of pain and at the brink of death, he takes every precaution he can to send the relevant information, but he can't get through. It's tragic, and not even the best part of this fallout. Colonel Mustang and he had this straight guy, funny guy dynamic thus far, and with Mustang putting up with Hughes' antics for the sake of peace. But when we were at the funeral, and we see Mustang reflect on this, it's clear to see what Hughes meant to him specifically, and how badly this impacts him. Which means, moving forward, he's determined to come to grips with how he died, and more importantly, why he died. And once he gets to the crime scene, watching his detective abilities on show was fascinating. It's so easy to write these kinds of deductions like a super genius tying inconsequential pieces of information together in nonsensical fashions. But Arakawa does so here in a clever but grounded way. Mustang observed that Hughes chose to call from an outside line because he must have had reason to. Perhaps their ranks are compromised or involved. This is a perfectly reasonable deduction for him to make. Furthermore, once Armstrong arrives on the scene, Mustang reads in between the lines of what he says to him, inferring he has a gag order from someone higher up than even he, and understood from his wording that there are 2 murderers on the loose. I love this mystery surrounding the government, the Philosopher's Stone, and how the Ishvalans play into it, not to mention Edward and Al. It's fascinating, and in making us want to figure this out, it also makes us focus on the world building all that more. I'm gonna be real, not much happens in Rust Valley in terms of plot progression, but a lot takes place in terms of world building and context for the narrative. Seeing this place where all the main soldiers go to after the war to get themselves some nice looking prosthetics is both interesting and unsettling, with even the inhabitants saying as much, with a new character called Paninia's Legs acting as the launching point that transports us up this mountain to find a dude to train Winry in the ways of making better automail, and of course, childbirth. Functionally, this place acts as a sobering reminder of the world that they live in, all the while offering up Winry her little hyperbolic time chamber arc. And once she emerges from this place, she will no doubt make something awesome for Edward. I think a large part of the story's appeal comes from a tormented world being seen through the innocent and well-meaning eyes and actions of 2 young children. These 2, Edward and Alphonse, are our only anchors to this world, and we make sense of it with the help of these 2. And after traveling so far to get answers to seek out training so that they may be better equipped to continue their journey, it made me stop to think for a moment. The following portion of story concerns itself and deals with the context surrounding the events that took place on that day that they lost everything. It's tragic, heartbreaking, and every other similar adjective. But at the end of the day, this is a story about equivalent exchange. Will the hardship the 2 boys inevitably have to go through be enough in exchange for achieving their ultimate goal? It isn't uncommon for shonen stories to concern themselves with the protagonist pushing towards some unreachable goal. In fact, it's sort of a staple of the genre and many other films, for that matter. The indomitable spirit of these characters as they take on the world, so to speak. Whether it be Luffy's journey to become the Pirate King or Goku surpassing his limits to overcome some great evil. The theme of fighting against impossible odds is one that's become integral for many of these stories. However, what I believe sets this one apart is that the goal is something which is described as quite literally impossible. Its impossibility is a staple of the world, its rules and the greater narrative. It's what sets the goal apart from most others I've read about. Because where there was hope in One Piece and Dragon Ball, here it seems to be the case that there is none. And the tone of the narrative seems to reflect that. Unlike Goku, who just needs to try harder, or Luffy, who needs to keep searching and adventuring for the One Piece that we are all told time and again exists, by the way, when it comes to Edward and his brother, there isn't a clear path forward, and every sign points to this being impossible, which means there's no obvious journey. Instead, this goal is shrouded in mystery, with us as viewers and indeed these characters uncertain as to whether even the direction they're pushing in will get them closer to where they ultimately want to be, or if it's simply more wasted time. Normally, an approach like this would leave an audience in want, or at the very least, confused. Generally speaking, we know how Goku overcomes the next threat, training and practice. Similar observations and expectations can be made for the likes of Luffy. However, with Edward and Al, there's no expectation beyond just not giving up in the face of literal impossibilities. And brilliantly, what's communicated through such a framework is an impressive and deeply relatable set of circumstances for me. It's a fascinating take on the genre, and one that grants this tale an air of darkness and misery that permeates through the pages I've read, but not in a way that's so overwhelming it detracts from the experience. And as a result, at this point in my adult life, where problems with no obvious solution present themselves more often than not, watching these 2 tirelessly search in the face of unwavering impossibility with earnest and optimism was both incredibly inspirational and tragic. The anime adaptations. While this series, like the vast majority of reviews on this channel, focuses on the original source material, the manga in this case, it would be completely irresponsible of me to ignore the 2 anime adaptations this series has received, particularly when one of them has topped every single fan-voted best anime list for over a decade. And frankly, it's very easy to see why both are so beloved. Regardless of which version you pick, you're going to find yourself drowning in a sea of phenomenally well-directed and animated scenes. These are exemplary productions, and it's the quality on its floor rather than its ceiling that I think is one of the #1 reasons it's sustained itself in people's memories for so long. They are firing on all cylinders in ways few studios can sustain, particularly across over 4 cores of consistent production. And it's how this was achieved that's perhaps one of the most interesting aspects of both series' productions. And I am of course referring to its outsourcing. The thought of outsourcing tends to conjure up thoughts of melting productions and poor animation quality, or it's seen as a cheap, corner-cutting alternative to in-house creation. And while it's easy to see why that's the case, particularly in the modern era of anime productions, outsourcing is not inherently a bad thing. Take Dragon Ball Z for example. Almost all of its episodes are outsourced to studios outside of Toei, even those widely considered some of the strongest of the series. The reason for this is simply due to how anime episodes are made. Multiple episodes are in production at once with teams dedicated to each of them, and they rotate through episodes to keep the production flowing. When you have a show with a huge number of episodes, there's only so much staff at a time that can be able to be dedicated to them, and so outsourcing becomes a necessity to 1. Allow the production to exist in the first place, and 2. To allow bigger episodes to have more time for their completion. 2003's Fullmetal Alchemist anime had 21 of its 51 episodes outsourced. That's almost 2 full seasons of anime. In Brotherhood's 64 episode run, 25 of those were entirely outsourced too. Studio names like PA Works, Doga Kobo, Telecom, and A1 Pictures are just a few who worked on these shows, and I'm sure some of you savvy fans will notice some of these support studios have since gone on to produce high quality shows all on their own. It shouldn't be a surprise then that much like the Dragon Ball example I used earlier, some of its best episodes came from those external studios. And then when you throw in Studio Bones' top tier staff on top of that, for those that may not be aware, given how much Bones has become a household name in their own right these days, the studio was actually formed from Sunrise's strongest production team by its producer, Masahiko Minami. As a result, it still maintains strong ties to mecha animators to this very day, and while Fullmetal Alchemist doesn't exactly have much in the way of mechs, there's a work ethic and craftsmanship that carries over regardless. Its wide array of talented animation directors will not only correct faces for model accuracy, but often go above and beyond to elevate the scene as a whole. And really, it all comes together to explain just how these shows maintain an absurd level of polish during even its lowest moments. On the 2003 side of things, the series is led by director Seiji Mizushima, who is lovingly nicknamed Fatty by his staff, and is the person the director was based off of in the Shirobako anime. I don't think that's a nickname that's looked on all too kindly these days, but by all accounts, he was a real joy to work under, and the team had a great deal of respect for him in spite of that nickname. But for the most part, his directorial experience was mecha related, but he led the Shaman King anime in 2001, and while that series certainly doesn't shy away from its mech influences, I think the ability to also capture that fun shonen energy made him the perfect fit for a series like Fullmetal Alchemist. For the Brotherhood adaptation, Fullmetal Alchemist found itself directed by
Yasuhiro Irie,
an animator turned director who, much like so many of Bones' staff, also had intense ties to mecha anime. He's someone who's been quite vocal about his love of Hayao Miyazaki's work also, citing Kiki's Delivery Service as one of the reasons he got into anime in the first place. It's an influence you can very clearly see in his debut show, Kurao: Phantom Memory. It's just chock full of solid layouts with a real emphasis on the fundamentals of animation. However, that show was only 2 cores long, and that meant he was able to have a real hands-on approach to directing, using his strong drawing skills to really elevate the production itself. Contrast, Brotherhood's 64 episodes were more than double the length of Phantom Memories, and so that approach was simply never going to work. Instead, he had to lean heavily on the individual directors and storyboard artists on board the production. Delegating duties like that can be scary and sometimes leads to jarring disparity in quality across episodes, but thankfully he was blessed with a very strong directorial team within Bones itself, and a lot of that outsourcing sure helped alleviate the pressure too. In the behind the scenes sections of any other video, now would be an incredible time to talk about the character designers for each show, but I think with both series sporting seriously impressive design work either way, it's an element that's wholly down to preference on the whole, really. 2003's designs came from Yoshiyuki Ito, who's arguably a bit of a legend in this department. He's done some spectacular designs for the likes of Space Dandy, Hiso Maso, and there's a really distinct flavor to his work that seeps into his Fullmetal Alchemist designs too. They sport a far sharper edge than the manga's artwork and really lean into the idea of an adaptation rather than a perfect copy. On the flip side, Brotherhoods came from Hiroshi Hiroki Kano, whose design background really only extends to Razaphone and the Yu Yu Hakusho movie. In spite of this, his work here is remarkably competent too, with a staunch adherence to Arakawa's rounder and looser style. It looks great and really helps to sell the idea that Brotherhood exists to represent the manga as a whole, while 2003 veered off in its own direction by necessity. However, where both series really shine are their individual animators, the key players, the major stars, and I think to do them justice, they require their own space for a thorough exploration of what they offer each series. I'll be sure to include their section in future videos regarding this topic. But in the meantime, I think it's important to cover an aspect of the anime that is arguably as defining as its visuals. Its music. Similar to the visual production side of the anime, it's hard to go wrong with music for either anime adaptation of the story. Both excel in their respective approaches and bring with them tracks and motifs that have since become deeply beloved by nearly all who watch the shows. But what I find interesting between both of them is that they do have different approaches. Fundamentally, I mean. And I think those differences really highlight the differences in general direction both shows took in their adaptations. The original series score was composed by Michiru Oshima, and when I first watched it, I was honestly surprised by how grounded and earthy the whole thing felt. Both scores are certainly rooted in a sense of emotion and wonder, but Oshima's focus really seemed to be on the down-to-earth aspect of the story. Most of the tracks feature a lot of instrumentation that feels familiar to us as viewers. Strings, horns, drums, the whole 9 yards. Whereas with Brotherhood's score, composed by Akira Senju, it was immediately clear to me how different the two composers envisioned this story and its world. Senju has gone on record in interviews saying he purposely didn't watch or listen to the 2003 series before composing Brotherhood, but rather read the manga and tried to imagine up what the world would sound like. And where Oshima heard a grounded story set in a fantastic world, Senju clearly heard a story of fantasy, tragedy, and hope. Brotherhood's score focuses deeply on its emotional beats and a sense of fantasy and wonder. Pianos, string sections, and choral arrangements are everywhere in this score. There's a very grandiose nature to it all. It reminds me of something like Lord of the Rings, where its music and direction made each moment feel like the audience was lucky to be witnessing history in the making for these fantastic worlds. And yet, there's something that just keeps bringing me back to Oshima's 2003 approach to the show. No, don't get me wrong, the Brotherhood soundtrack is packed to the brim with absolutely wonderful works of music, helping the adaptation elevate its emotional beats higher than ever before, but I personally feel really drawn to the more grounded approach of the original show's score. As I read through the manga, the story and its world really did feel like upbeat characters with fantastical powers that feel secondary to the conviction and heart in the face of seemingly relentless negativity and impossible odds. So the direction of leaning into the character-driven element rather than the fantastical resonated with me personally. It's a direction I don't think a lot of composers, when tasked with writing for a story as crazy as Fullmetal Alchemist, would take. It very much reminds me of John Williams' score for Star Wars, where you also had this extremely fantastical universe and events, but instead had the music focus on the earthly minutiae of the characters. Hell, there's even a fair bit of Star Wars trademark flugelhorn in Fullmetal Alchemist 2. But, jokes aside, the grounded atmosphere of this otherwise fantastical story is what draws me in so feverishly. In a world that's written to be filled with so many wondrous things, it stands to Arakawa that I myself am, more than anything else, enthralled by the story surrounding the two main characters, and I think there's very good reason for that. Once Ed and Al arrive at Izumi's place for training, it becomes clear that this section is going to deal with predominantly one thing: flashbacks. And it's interesting to sit and read through. We're painted a bleak picture of a mother dying of a sickness we never see her have. We see resentment for a father that's never there, and two very young kids looking to move mountains to save the only family they have. It's heartbreaking, and we haven't even seen the unnatural, torturous heartbreak yet. Having returned from their training with Izumi, we see the fabled event that's been alluded to from the very first page, the transmutation circle that almost cost them both everything. And this section is remarkably simple looking in the manga. Having come away from stories like Berserk, which depict dark fantasy horror better than anyone else, part of me was a little underwhelmed with how this looked in the manga, but in hindsight, I'm glad that once again the emphasis was on the characters and their dialogue. Getting a view of what happens in this transcendent state with Ed is a really cool idea, and I feel like it's littered with hints for the future and the mystery of this series, but honestly the most traumatic part is what follows. It's the aftermath, Ed's realization, his sacrifice, what creature he ends up creating in attempting to create his own mother. It's utterly horrifying, and the following reinforces the reasoning behind why Winry and Granny are so close to these two young boys now. I want to talk more about Al and Ed at the end of this video because I think their dynamic with this world is the key to this series, but right now I'd like to make a prediction, okay? It's theory time. In the immediate chapter after these events, we get the boys' first interaction with the government, and it's with Ron Mustang. Ron Mustang. Ron Mustang.
That's insulting.
But interestingly, due to some mistakes made on a government recruitment document, he arrives in town to pick up the Elric brothers thinking that they were both in their 30s, but I think this is way too coincidental and this story is way too tightly written for something like that to just be coincidence. Following this event, Ed is seen as someone special, and seeing as we haven't seen his father in the picture at all, I'm going to guess that he's behind this decision. Maybe as a way of protecting his kids, or perhaps, more likely, to take advantage of their current circumstances as students of Izumi and now having tried to transmute life itself. If either of these are true, then that would mean that their father needs to be someone high up in the government or military, someone who has access to these documents. This also explains his consistent absence. I mean, it can't be Mustang, he's too young. It can't be Hughes, he's too dead. It could be Armstrong, the hair color matches and he cares for them quite a lot. And it could be President Bradley too, but we don't really know much about this fellow beyond that he has a network of intelligence and wants the boys out of the current investigation, which tracks with this. With that said, it could still all just be coincidence. The writing for this flashback isn't perfect. I mean, this is all framed, if you remember, as a flashback, a story Ed and Al are recanting to Izumi upon her request. But in this, we see conversations like that with Mustang or Winry that they weren't privy to. So how could they see these people's perspective?
How did you know about the parts you weren't there for?
I don't know personally, but what I do know is that Bradley seems to be following Edward around like a love-struck teen lately, which brings me to my favorite part of this story so far. Okay, Bradley's a bad guy. Damn it! I predicted this a while ago and my hope was to end this video with this being my prediction. Now everyone's gonna think I read ahead and just wrote something like, oh yeah, this dude's totally a bad guy, and definitely didn't read ahead to spoil myself. So no, I'm not lying. I knew it, I predicted it. Please believe me. The following section is the most compelling, or at the least, most action-packed part of the story so far that I've read. It's got revelation, tension, and filled with promises for the future. Alphonse Elric is tasked with rejogging his own memory concerning the events or visions he saw that very night he lost, physically, everything. According to Ed himself, he saw something that brought him closer to the answer they needed, but when it came to Al, he's forgotten everything. And thus is the goal of this next section. The way Arakawa goes about it is by creating a complicated spider's web of mixed motivations. We're introduced to the latest and best sin, Greed, who along with his lackeys kidnap Al so that he can reveal to them his secret to immortality. Greed is an infectious personality, roguish and boisterous. He fears little and never stops talking. He's exactly the sort of character that makes for a fantastic scene partner for the likes of Al, who seldom speaks in comparison. On the other side of this, we have Izumi and her husband, who offers so much comedy, my sides were hurting just reading through it. I'm a big fan of the protective but gritty persona Izumi exudes too, but the real interest doesn't take shape until Ed, who up until this point had been seeing to his alchemy assessment, finds himself followed by Bradley back home, where he realizes that Al is in trouble, kidnapped. Seeing Edward in this big brother role is awesome to see, and what's hilarious is that Greed, who was up until this point the most unstable personality, once he meets Ed, he realizes what he's up against. This is a kid who isn't going to make a deal with such a dicey figure. The fight is compelling and Greed is terrifying. It makes me wonder if all the sins are capable of showing their true forms like this. But I think the most impactful part of all of this that people will remember and be in awe of is the reveal of Bradley. He is a competent fighter, yes, oh my god, yes, he's terrifying, but it's what happens in the sewer and the meeting he has later on with the other sins that really speaks to the terror of this situation. military is compromised from the very top. He is led by this old man hooked up to a bunch of pipes. Maybe this is Edward and Al's dad now. I don't know, just throwing it out there. It's a complete shot in the dark. But all I do know is that Bradley was the one that named Edward the Fullmetal Alchemist. And with that being his official title and the name of this series, it makes me wonder if there's any significance to that name at all. Only time will tell, I think. And so, bringing this video to a close, I find myself in an unfamiliar position as a reviewer looking at this for the very first time. Specifically because this story isn't at all like what I expected it to be. And while I have only read about 1/3 of this story presently, I feel like I am starting to understand the dynamic of Alphonse and Edward so much more clearly now. And what was once an interesting duo to lead this tale has helped me better appreciate what Arakawa is trying to say with them in a profound way. A cursory glance at this story might lead you to believe that Edward is the most important character in the story and that his brother Alphonse is a sweet but ultimately secondary player in this story, acting only as a motivating force to push his older, more active brother into action. And while I fell prey to that very thinking initially, now I'm embarrassed to have thought that ever was the case. For it's the dynamic these two share in accordance with the antagonists of this world that effectively make up what Fullmetal Alchemist is trying to say as a story. And I think what makes this story as emotionally resonant as it ultimately is. But what do I mean? There is a lot of philosophy in this story. However, for the purposes of this one point and prediction I'd like to make, I want to focus on 3 central points of view. Starting off with Edward. From the very first page, it's clear what the events that define Edward are. In chapter 6, he's haunted by horrific dreams brought on by his guilt surrounding the incident. Right before their first run-in with Scar, he talks about how doubtful he is in the feasibility of getting his brother his body back. When I first saw Ed meet Dr. Marco, I saw this as a stark contrast between 2 very different individuals. Dr. Marco, someone who's haunted by the past sins of the government and military such that he harbors deep-rooted resentment, projecting them onto Edward, who I thought was convincingly not allowing his past to define him and instead push forward. The first time we see Edward in the manga is at the single most traumatic moment in his life before cutting to him pushing forward in a light-hearted fare. It demonstrates exactly who he is as a character. Tortured, yes, but also tenacious and convicted, working with his trauma in a productive way. And I thought that was it for a very long time, until Ed visits his mom's grave because he's restless. He wants to spend every single moment pushing towards his goal, making progress on a journey that seems hopeless, all the while Al, who has lost the most out of the two, is much more inclined to insist that they rest and enjoy the day. Edward has an outwardly good attitude towards leaving negativity in the past, but he seems to always be focusing on it, using it as a fuel, with the most pressing cost to him being his sacrifice of the today, the here and now. There's an interesting quote from Granny Pinocchio on Edward Elric and his nature in this chapter too. It says, "I wondered where in that little body all that strength was coming from. And because he's so strong, I worry that when he does finally find an obstacle he can't overcome, will he be able to get back on his feet?" By pairing this exposition with the small outing Edward is on to his mother's grave, it gives this chapter a very heavy and emotional atmosphere rooted in the mistakes of the past and how they inform our futures. Not just through Edward's tireless pursuit of answers to his greatest problem, but even with regards to the Ishvalan War that took Winry's parents and Granny Pinocchio's family. While those events took so much from them, it very much defines how they live now. Granting prosthetics is a successful business thanks to the war's aftermath, and similarly, that horrific past even now defines both Edward and Alphonse's lives as they know it. Exemplified almost immediately after once Ed gets his arm back for the very first time, he runs to repair his brother without hesitation. Everything he does, all of this study, all of the torment and struggle, it's not just for himself, it's for his brother, and that's what he cares about. So let's talk about Alphonse. Alphonse, while having the most to gain from this mission, is the one who, interestingly, is more grounded in the here and now. While he still wishes to regain his mortal body, he does so for totally different reasons to why Edward pushes in such a direction. He wants the body not to make up some difference and to get even with the universe, but to instead better enjoy the here and now. There are massive ethical and physical struggles over the morality of extending a person's natural life towards immortality in this story. This is visually demonstrated through the horrific chimeras as well as all the actions of the sins themselves. In the the case of Alphonse, he has everything the antagonists of this story want. He has an immortal existence on this plane, and that's exactly what makes him dislike his current existence so much. Because without being able to feel pain, taste good food, or feel the rain in his skin or the wind in his hair, it's all just a muted experience, a life that's practically meaningless. And you might think that Edward is closer to Al's outlook on life than the antagonists of this story, but I would argue differently. Unlike Alphonse, Edward is the one to blame for the bulk of what tragedy unfolded. He led the charge, and as a result of that, met a series of crippling consequences along the way, both literally and figuratively. In order to right these wrongs he sees himself having committed, he doesn't allow his feelings to compromise his forward progression. However, in the same way the villains of the story have their focus squarely on the future they want for themselves, Edward's mind is consumed with guilt over his past. And nowhere is this more evident than in Rush Valley, where we learn of his state alchemist pocket watch, where on the inside of it is etched a specific date, the 3rd of October, a date he promised himself he would never lose focus of. For those same reasons, he destroyed his family home. He is so consumed by the guilt of that event and the consequences he wrought on his own family that he has dedicated every waking moment to perfecting and investigating this mysterious power system in the hopes that one day it will reveal to him something that will allow him to move on with the rest of his life free of guilt, impossible as it seems to be. So in a way, he is as good and as talented as he is, not just because he's a genius, but because he's obsessed. And perhaps that's why he denies that compliment every single time it's offered to him. Alphonse has the immortality that everyone is after, and yet he hates it, while Ed is living in the past and others are worried about their futures. This is a story not just about equivalent exchange, but about life itself, what you need to give up on or not give up in order to lead a fulfilling life. And ironically, and tragically, Alphonse, who's always telling Ed to slow down and enjoy the moment, to rest and to have fun, he seems to be the only one who truly understands what life is all about, and that a great life needs to be one that ends at some point. And even if we want to take a step back and think about things more abstractly from Ed, Alphonse, or any other character in this story, perhaps the lesson is that we can't create full appreciation for something unless we lose it first in exchange.
太陽に近づきすぎれば燃え尽きるだけ。
真っ白な景色に今誘われて僕は行くよまだ見ぬ世界へ、
Deception, espionage, thrilling action. Like, way too much fire. More fire than I'm comfortable with personally. And I'm not kidding when I say that this manga just went from great to incredible in the span of 3 chapters, and I cannot express just how much I lost my mind while reading this section. So let's try to figure out how they achieved this and why it works so damn well. And to kick it off, I'm of course going to be talking about the framing of Lieutenant Maria Ross and the incident at Lab number 3. To kick off this trek through peak fiction valley, Lieutenant Maria Ross, everyone's favorite subordinate of Colonel Mustang with a pistol, gets framed for the murder of Hughes. Now, at no point did I think that she was actually guilty or to blame. The story is written such that you're meant to sympathize with her, which makes what happens later oh so much more spicy. Arakawa, you're one sadistic woman that has a weird obsession with cows, but that's okay because you write incredible stories. But honestly, a lot of that deception here in this section is quite thinly veiled. However, with that said, it did cause me to become all the more anxious, so that's a good thing. With Ross being wrongfully framed, Edward and Al finding out about this last minute, and Barry looking to spring her from the prison, this was clearly all building to something significant, and boy, oh boy, was it ever.
Maria Ross だな。
何?
Okay, I know, right? This is amazing. This is nuts and freaked me the hell out upon first discovering what was left of the supposed Lieutenant Maria Ross. I was like, okay, story, that was pretty cool, but little did I know that the real stuff was just around the corner. Naturally, again, I didn't think that Mustang had this in him. He had been so dedicated to figuring out who unalived Hughes that there'd be no way that he'd be willing to, without hesitation, overreact to an escaping convict like this. No chance, particularly when it comes to Ross, especially given what we know about her situation, which you might see as a negative in the story. Should I have thought this was genuine? I don't really know, but I honestly don't think it matters, because once again, this all just made me lean in that much more as a reader. Something big was going down and we weren't being told about it. Now that said, when the dental records came up as a match, I did have a brief moment of pause to second guess myself, but you know what? I said no way. No way Mustang did that. They had to figure out some way around that. And the fallout of this after is handled remarkably well. From the action to the prior chapter to this one, the framing of events and tone of the material is far much more subdued and sad, as Ed and Al go to visit Hughes' family to explain themselves and to, well, apologize. There's an interesting lack of text or dialogue, instead allowing us to just exist in these moments with these characters. It's some of my favorite panel work by Arakawa, in all honesty, and I think that's saying something given what she's done so far. Much the same way Ghibli knows how to use silence in their productions to evoke certain feelings from their audiences, Arakawa in this chapter knew how to strip back her stories such that the dialogue doesn't get in the way of these compositions she's constructed. It's fantastic, and it only gets better from here. This is where things really start to get crazy, and all the pieces we've seen not quite make sense start to make more sense and come together. Well, okay, not exactly. There's still some confusion when Armstrong randomly attacks Edward's arm out of nowhere and then drags him back to his hometown for, quote, repairs, wink wink, and then you get Mustang chatting on the phone to his girlfriend, wink wink. And from this point on, when the attack on Barry the Chopper using his old body occurs in the apartment that they were hiding out in, I honestly don't think I was prepared for what ultimately happened afterwards. As I mentioned in my last video, this seems to be a story that has its focus squarely on the characters and their respective stories. And as a result, the story itself has been spectacular, but there hasn't been as much emphasis on fighting as I would have come to expect from certain shonen stories. Even with the more emotional and subversive ones like Hunter x Hunter, that series' first arc was entirely built around shonen-style combat and competition, whereas Fullmetal Alchemist has been extremely restrained and measured in its approach, I think, regarding fighting. Well, that is up until now, because from this initial fight spawns the single best and most exciting sequences of fights I've seen in years as a reviewer, and I mean that. So again, just for context, my mindset going into this was that I expected something was up with Mustang and that Ross had to be somewhere. She couldn't be dead. But I had no idea how Barry the Chopper and his crew hiding out in the apartment fitted into this equation. And just as I'm thinking that, Lanfan senses 20 souls encroaching on their location. Now, that's a super handy dandy ability, and as soon as Mustang rallies his forces for support, Lanfan just pieces out and rushes towards those 20 souls. But first of all, can we just appreciate Mustang's subversion here? All those secret conversations were all set up for this ambush of an ambush, to leverage this occasion to bring him closer to the answers that he's looking for. The truth within the truth, if you will, or whatever that Marco guy said. Havoc and Hawkeye pretty much go all guns blazing, trying to make a difference, and that's when something unaccounted for goes wrong.
いけない。電話はまたにするわ。こっちもお客が来てしまった。
Oh my god! Time to deal with this now, and so bullets don't seem to work. Not great, given that you're the bullet girl. Okay, think about things. And it's around here I remembered what Lanfan said earlier, right before she dashed away. She sensed 20 souls, but then found envy. They have all these lives trapped inside of them, or at least that's my impression right now, that's my theory. Maybe Greed never cared about dying because he had so many souls inside of him already. He had an overabundance of them, you could say. I mean, that tracks with the Greed moniker, right? And Gluttony, I can imagine the same is true for him, given how many times he's been shot and laughed it off like it was nothing. But hey, this girl seems to be doing a number on Envy, successfully one-upping Envy time and again, but not before shooting a flare to alert Mustang to their location. Hopefully, he can get there in time to save Hawkeye from Gluttony. And this is just the beginning, guys. Can we talk about this not even being the good bit yet? Okay, I have to chill. Breathe, Mark. Whew. You're a professional. Get it together. This is amazing! Okay, everyone follows the body of Barry the Chopper back to Laboratory 3 as it retreats back to base. And this is where stuff goes down. My god, does it go down. So, the first thing that blew my eyebrows off was the girlfriend Havoc has been talking about lightheartedly over the course of these last few chapters. It's lust! And she's ready to throw hands or nails or whatever the hell she's doing, but whatever it is, it's scary and also kind of hot, but really scary primarily. And guys, this section is like revelation after revelation. I know I sound like I'm freaking out, but that's really the energy of these chapters. For a story that's been holding its cards super close to its chest since the beginning, only filtering the info out slowly across many chapters, seeing this flood of information was insane. Like Lust demonstrating that her core is the Philosopher's Stone and it's how they were created. Like, I don't even know what that means. Mustang and Havoc versus Lust, I guess. She's been present the entire series, but now she's taking center stage. It's time to face Lust. This is top tier shonen shenanigans if ever I did see it, in the best of ways. My god, the beauty of this sequence is mwah, chef's kiss. I just have to gush for a few seconds, alright, because I found it that exciting. And one of the reasons it's great is primarily due to the power system of the world in question. You can look at any great shonen story, and 9 times out of 10, their best fights are the ones that can exist only within their established world. Well, once you remove character at least. Naruto, Dragon Ball, One Piece, they all have amazing fights, and most of these great fights depend on the various systems that they have in place, whether they are simple or complicated, to give the altercation its own sense of dramatics and flair. And Fullmetal Alchemist in this one is no different. It's been established that Mustang, while powerful, seems to need a few things in place in order to be effective, or so we were led to believe at this point. He circumvents transmutation circles thanks to the gloves that he wears, and naturally, if the area has too much rain, the fire that he uses won't work. These are his limitations, and any Dragon Ball fan will tell you that once you add limitations to a technique, the tension rises. And good old Ron the Roy Mustang is no different here. Lust is in the position of power and overwhelming each of them, and it's from here she makes a calculated decision. She floods the room in water and retreats further into the building. As readers and viewers, we can cast our minds back to earlier in the story where the rain prevented Mustang from using his abilities in the first place, and thus we assume this case is identical to that one. But we and she were wrong. And this is where Arakawa writes a simple solution that makes total sense in her story. Mustang uses alchemy to remove the flammable gas from the liquid beneath him. That is genius, and not only that, turns the room she's hiding within into a bomb. Look, that was awesome. And Mustang says things like, oh yeah, she's totally cooked. I can feel the fat in the air landing on my lips. I mean, I gotta be real, I didn't need to hear that, but it's a neat little detail. But you know what else is a neat little detail? That. Not good for the heroes, but it was pretty cool. And when she said, I don't like being broken up with, I just know Arakawa was having all sorts of fun when she was writing this one. But the most hardcore part is when Mustang, with his bare hands, rips the Philosopher's Stone out of her chest in an effort to stop her and heal Havoc. But she just begins to regenerate around the stone itself and his hand. Oh my god, that looks so creepy in the manga, and it made me wonder, does this mean that they are the stone? That every stone that was created is just another one of the homunculi? Also, I just noticed that if Lust Stone is there in her chest, and that's her tattoo, then that means that the tattoo's placement is directly correlated to the position of the stone itself within the host, which means Bradley's is in his eye and Gluttony's is in his tongue. Whatever the case, it's a crazy set of circumstances, and it's so fun to watch and speculate on. And while things go from bad to worse in this fight against Lust, Mr. I'm the secret evil king of the world Bradley shows up alone to intervene. At this point, I was curled up into a ball, feverishly flipping from page to page. I needed to know how this fight was going to end. And with the spooky, disembodied voice of Pride, the only other homunculi unaccounted for us, calling both envy and gluttony back to base, it's safe to say that with Havoc unconscious and Mustang on the verge of death, now mortally wounded, things aren't looking good, guys. So Lust walks away from Mustang, leaving him to bleed out, instead choosing to confront Alphonse Elric. And while this could be considered the downbeat of the segment, there's a lot of narrative resonance to it, I think. A big motivating factor for Al moving forward is to ensure that no one has to pay for his mistakes or lack of ability again. And when you think about it, he's every bit as capable as his older brother. He just has the wrong mindset about it. In fact, every chance Edward gets, he points out just how much better his little brother is than him, whether it be fighting or alchemy or whatever. Fullmetal Alchemist as a title could very easily be talking about Al and not Edward Elric. In every way that matters, Al can be viewed as the main character if you want to. And in this scene, he shows a level of grit and tenacity that really made me respect him all the more as a character.
よく言った。アルフォンス・エルリック。
Don't lose your way.
Oh my god, okay. Whew, when this happened, I'm not kidding when I say I literally shouted, "Holy fuck!" and jumped off my chair. This dude, Ronnie Boy Mustang, cauterized his own wound, etched a transmutation circle onto his own fist, and used Havok's lighter as an ignition point. He's an absolute animal, and to boot, he actually kills Lust. Can we talk about him actually being the first person to kill one of the homunculi? I mean, okay, I thought this was impossible. This is the most amazing fight scene, and I just have chills talking about it.
Fullmetal Alchemist.
Switching gears now, we have Edward's side of the story to talk about and analyze. If you remember, he was dragged away before all this epic stuff went down, and while he does get dragged off to the middle of the desert to see a not dead Maria Ross, oh hey, look, yeah, she's pretty alive, and some ruins, I gotta say the best part of this section reveals even more than what Alan Mustang got up to with Miss Lust Combust. For on his way to visit his mom's grave in his hometown, he runs into a familiar face.
Oh my god!
Yep, that's right, it's Pipe Man, or at least he looks like the leader of the homunculi, I guess. I mean, he's got the same beard and stuff. But with that said, and jokes aside, I actually loved this sequence in the manga. There's this super interesting conversation between Hoenheim and Edward that takes place right before his mother's and his wife's grave. Hoenheim draws attention to his burned down home, asking Ed, why did he do that? And Edward gives his typical answer, so that he can't look back, that it's a symbol of his resolve, his conviction in his overall goal we are all too aware of. And to that, his father disagrees, citing that it looks as though, to him, that Ed's hiding his mistakes so that he doesn't have to confront them. I personally don't know how to feel about this. Ed proves this thinking was wrong almost right away later in the story, but then again, I don't know if he'd have dug up that body in the backyard had he not felt his father could have been onto something here. But ignoring that for just a second, I do think it's interesting that he, Hoenheim, levels that criticism at Edward, his son. And my working theory right now is that it could very well be Hoenheim projecting. Think about it. At this moment in time, we have no clue as to why he's been gone for all these years. And then we see a scene like this. Earlier in the story, Hoenheim reveals that Ed is a lot like him, and to that I think what he means is that he's similar physically, yes, but also similar in his ability to get things done, his conviction, and from that moment he moves to take the only photo that exists of Trisha, his wife, himself and his two kids that exists right before leaving. However, not before saying that something terrible is coming and that Pinako should leave this country. Okay, so obviously, I'm excited for the implications of that last line, but I'd also like to further analyze what just happened here because the aftermath is sort of incredible. To confront what his dad just said, Edward, like I said, digs up the supposed body of his mother and discovers that not the bones nor the hair match his mother in the slightest. And through this discovery, it's revealed to Edward that he may be closer to helping his brother regain his body than he might think, and the connection made here is memory. The analysis and questions Ed posits to the group upon his return are unreal, proving that Al is the real Al because he has memories that he, Edward, couldn't possibly know about, and says that Al's new memories, the ones made after the incident, must be being stored in his body somewhere. That there's a connection between the body and soul, and that connection is the spirit. Al needs a physical body to house his thoughts and memories, and so That's his theory, that it must exist somewhere. And I think it's an awesome theory because it correlates perfectly with what Barry the Chopper's body confirmed for us earlier in the story. What was once so random now acts as a clever piece of foreshadowing of this very thread that I never anticipated. Al paid the toll to pass through the portal of truth, whatever that means, and so it begs the question, what's the truth that lies within the truth? They're using the word truth as like a noun in this instance, like it's referring to a particular thing, like a person or something, or an entity. Now, I've no earthly idea what's going on, but I do have another theory, so buckle up. I'm calling it here that Hoenheim is the leader of the homunculi, but even further beyond that, there's a moment he shares with Pinnacle where he alludes to not appearing to age. This is curious and got me thinking. Perhaps he doesn't seem to age for the same reasons the lifespan of all the homunculi and villains seem to be extended, and maybe he has the same goal Ed had to save his wife's life. Like I mentioned before, he seems to see a lot of himself in Edward, and if there's one thing that's for certain about Edward, is that he's got some impossibly strong convictions. Convictions that have led him to do some horrible things both to others inadvertently and to himself carelessly. And perhaps Hoenheim is of a similar mindset and capability. Perhaps his wife Trisha was sick and told him that she would hang on until he found a way to extend someone's life beyond natural means. This would then make sense of what Trisha said to Panico before she died, and it would explain why Hoenheim is so nonchalant about the time he missed with his kids and his wife. 10 years is an incredibly long period of time to go without seeking or making contact with them whatsoever, and given that he took the only photograph of them together, it implied, at least to me, some sort of emotional connection or fondness at the very least. And so, in my mind, taking the photo and choosing not to see them for 10 years, that doesn't really seem to correlate or work together in my mind, unless time doesn't matter to him. Because once he finds the answer to immortality, to his wife's death, time, it won't matter. It's infinite. And if this is true and is his goal, then that positions Edward as the perfect polar thematic opposite to his father, stopping the ideology he once so feverishly sought to bring into this world in the past, but through his experiences learned the truth within the truth, in the process coming to appreciate that life is so special, and as special as it is, because it ends eventually, and that we should enjoy what we have while we have it. To prove this, Ed will have to stop his own father from trying to resurrect his own mother and to solve for immortality. But that's just a theory. And alright, so we have a better idea of what's going on now. Ed and Al are back together, thankfully. They're on the same page. Brilliant! They're determined to shoulder all of this without getting anyone else hurt, and what's more, they have a plan. This is a great plan. It might have a million different ways it can fail, might not get them what they want, and might also unalive them both, but it's a great plan nevertheless, using themselves as bait to lure in the homunculi to rescue their supposedly valuable selves. This is a very clever and ballsy move by Edward, and I honestly love it. It's so exciting to watch too, particularly when Gluttony and oh, I forgot to mention, yeah, Glut and Envy got Marco before Breda and Mustang did to help Havoc, and he can't walk, it's sad, whatever. But as I was saying, this is a great plan, simply because this time we have a backup, and I'm not talking about Mustang. I've thought for a long time that Lanfan and the folks from Jing have had a fascinating ability to sense what makes the homunculi part of what they are, what gives them away, that they are a cluster of souls engulfed inside one entity. It's a spooky fact, but were it to be true, it's kind of a remarkably handy trait for them to possess. And this ability they have, it works. They get their hands on who they're after, but as it happens, I was wrong. Not every homunculi is built the same. Wrath, apparently, he's built different. He passes as human, not just to the broader military, not just to Edward and Al, but to Lanfan and Lynn also, which is crazy because it leads to this. He slices Lanfan. No. And okay, this is a weird one. Not because Lanfan gets slashed, although that is certainly less than optimal for her, but, that's not what I'm talking about here. You see, in the anime, things progress as normal from this scene henceforth. The encounter continues and we switch perspectives to another altercation. However, in the manga, we get something entirely different. We get a short but illuminating scene with Hoenheim on a train that's taken over by bandits. And in this scene, he gets shot like a dozen times to no effect. He even goes as far afterwards to refer to himself as a monster. Now, I'm not a doctor, but I don't think normal human beings are able to do that. And so it further strengthens my case that he's either modified or not at all human anymore. Either way, I think it's a really strange choice for Brotherhood, the anime, to not adapt that, because on its face, it's a rather revealing and seemingly important scene, but oh well. Let's go back to the slicey slice. This is a surprisingly dramatic and strategic fight, and I didn't expect that at all. Lanfan is down and her only defense now resides in Ling, the person she's been tasked to protect, a character that up until now has acted like a freeloading spoiled prince. He's demonstrated some righteousness, but we've seen very little of him in serious action, predominantly leaning on a more comedic angle for a character. Until now. Immediately, he dashes to the aid of his subordinate, picking her up and confronting Wrath head-on, otherwise known as King Bradley, aka the scariest character in this story. And I think it's that aspect and our limited expectations of Ling that creates this wonder when Ling actually finds success. He employs strategy by consistently moving into his blind spot created by the eye patch and demonstrates a terrific level of combat ability. And even when cornered, he's always thinking about his next move. It's remarkable, and he even finds time to call out Bradley for being a fake king, adding a thematic element to it, that a king is for the people, not the other way around. And with that, throws a flash grenade to blind both Gluttony and Wrath, but one problem. That is freaking cool, man. I love that this story doesn't just have fights for the sake of fighting, and within these confrontations has actual strategy. Ling is wildly and very game here, achieving all of this with his limited movement. While other stories would rely on signature techniques time and time again, the combat in this story feels once again very grounded, and it's totally in keeping with the tone of the story at hand here. A world filled with so much magic and wonder, but torn apart by the bitter reality of it all. Ling doesn't use magic or secret powers to overcome Wrath, but instead takes advantage of all the same traits that are apparent to us at home. Other stories that rely on named techniques certainly have their place, but there's just something so satisfyingly unique and appropriate about this story's approach. It gives it a really fresh identity, I think. And on the flip side, there's another fight that's taking place that we return to, and unsurprisingly, this one, to add variety, focuses less on the combat aspect and more on the words being exchanged here. This, by design, isn't so much a fight, but more so Edward buying as much time as he can. However, when Scar confronted Ed and Al with the ethical quagmire that was the state they left Nina following Show Tucker's horrid affair, it really elevated the reality of this story once again. Nina wasn't a throwaway character that existed in an early chapter we're allowed to forget about like Ed and Al wanted. She wasn't some NPC. She deserved moral consideration, and Edward just left her because he had no answers for her situation. Lonely, cold, and scared, they left her to just exist in pain, and Scar saw to that. Whether you agree or disagree with his approach, at least he did something. That really hit home for me. This would be like if one of the goons from the Red Ribbon Army that Goku killed was brought back to our attention by one of their family. It just retroactively changes the tone of the entire story in a brilliant way, I think. Ed does snap back at Scar concerning Winry's parents and how he took them out, but unfortunately, it was at the wrong time. This is honestly a terrific moment that complements the reality I touched on earlier. Something I've come to learn over the years as a reviewer is that every series emphasizes different aspects of their story to transport us from point A to point B. In Dragon Ball and One Piece, it's perseverance and tenacity the story leans on. In Hunter x Hunter, it's trauma. In Attack on Titan, it's this lust for revenge. But in Fullmetal Alchemist, it's humanity. It's flaw. It's the unsightly elements of the real world that make us feel uncomfortable when looking at them. It's the healing hands of a genuinely caring and kind person in Winry holding a deadly weapon with the intention of ending another's life. This story truly and wonderfully leverages the horrors of reality and melds them with the fantasy elements sprinkled throughout. It's hope versus despair. But I am forever grateful that Edward reminds her of who she is to him. It's such a beautiful moment nestled in the horror of the occasion, and I just don't think anything could be more in keeping with the tone Arakawa is trying to go for with this series. It's an outstanding scene. And what's more is, the other fight scene crosses over into this one.
The following material is, and I kid you not, literally hype moment after sad moment after traumatizing moment after more hype moments. I was so excited reading this week's material that, geez, man, seriously, the story goes nuts. So, Ling exploding from the sewer below throws a flash grenade at Gluttony, this time demolishing his upper body, and what's more is, he ties what's left of his body up in metal cables, meaning Gluttony's regeneration ability is now working against him. I think I love Ling. Yeah. Hi, this is Future Mark here, and about loving Ling. I'm sorry, Past Mark, but you're in for a world of hurt later. But yeah, anyway, back to Past Mark. And as it happened, Lanfan didn't off herself, which is great for her, and instead cut off her own arm and tied it to a dog, which is not great for her, but is a win for the dog, creating a fake blood trail for Wrath to follow. I love strategy like that. It's so fun. And by fun, I mean, you know, not in the body horror sort of way. So look, I've not spoken about this little girl looking for Edward at all that came from Jing, and look, I honestly don't have any feelings one way or the other about her. Of all the characters in this story, of which the vast majority are great, she's not really vibed with me since she got here. I mean, I know she's cute, I know she has some weird powers, but I gotta see some more from her. So far, she's kinda mid. With that said, Ling and Lanfan's side of the fight has been exceptionally strong, and thankfully, there's more where that comes from later. But not right now, because the fight's over and Winry's going back to Rust Valley. Bye, Winry! Pride and Wrath have a convo. I still have absolutely no earthly idea who Pride is. I mean, he's gotta be someone in the military, right? Or at least the government, or someone in power. I just know this is gonna be another one of those reveals that will completely take me off guard, and I'm anxiously waiting for it to happen. Happen already! Alright, so let's break it down for just a second. Envy and Marco have a conversation that reveals their ultimate goal, and when that goal was revealed to me, I was like, which is Irish for the following. Their war has been in the name of blazing a trail that carves out an enormous transmutation circle around massive population centers in the land. They plan on sacrificing everyone in the circle to create the ultimate Philosopher's Stone, one capable of God knows what, and that is such a comic book level threat. It's so massive that I can't even really get, like, that's such a, it's cool, but it's weird. It's weird in like a horrific kind of way, but it's very good. I like it. Furthermore, there's also this air of the youth of this generation righting the sins of the past. Gluttony's rampage is terrifying, and the design he boasts is terrific here. Mustang escapes by the skin of his teeth, leading Ed, Al, and Lynn behind to fight. So, Envy shows up looking like a sort of horse thing that would make anyone scared of horses. Frankly, it's pretty dope though. Despite Envy showing up to take Gluttony home, they both get wrapped up into a fight with Ed, Al, and Lynn, obviously. Lynn takes Envy while Ed and Al try to tango with Gluttony. I love all of these fights in this section of the story because they're all never really just as simple as we gotta destroy blah blah blah. This entire scene is made possible because Envy and Gluttony are under strict orders not to do any damage to Edward or Al, which creates really interesting encounters, I think. Like when Ed and Al were trying to bait them into the situation, or like right now, where something really cool happens. And before I get to that, I think something that's become apparent is that Ling is a fantastic character to watch fight and make sense of a given situation with. In a world filled with what are effectively magic wielders, he's just a dude with a sword. He just happens to be cunning with some pocket sand and deceptively capable. Dang. This is a really cool moment, by the way, but when Ed steps in front of Ling as he's about to be eaten by Gluttony, I gotta say, damn. Firstly, Arakawa knows exactly how to write characters that let their actions do the talking, and secondly, Holy crap, I picked such a crazy spot to stop it last week. Like, ever since then, the fighting has been happening again and again and again, and it's been amazing. Like, let me paint you a picture. So, I'm enjoying myself, you know, reading the manga, having fun, and then Gluttony eats both Ed and Lynn whole. Like, what the hell is happening? I'm sad. Al is sad. The whole thing is sad. Okay, it's not that sad. The journey inside of the belly of Gluttony is largely funny, if not slightly unsettling given there's no clear way out. But I think this is also a wonderful look at what makes Fullmetal Alchemist as great as it is in microcosm. Last week I touted a fantastic trait Edward has in the ability to keep pressing forward despite how impossible things at present seem. Lynn even brings this up in this very section. They've shot guns in this space, opened bottomless holes in the floor, and have found that there doesn't seem to be any logical end to this place they've been trapped within. It very much, just like their overall goal in the story, seems impossible. But that doesn't stop Edward from earnestly trying, cracking wise, and remaining steadfast in his goal to move forward. He refuses to accept defeat, stubborn to the end. It's a wonderfully consistent character trait, I think.
あらら、お前たちかよ。
やはりエンビー。
Envy reveals that they were behind the Ishvalan Civil War, and thus the one behind Scar's killing intent motivation, and by proxy, the one that was indirectly responsible for Winry's parent death.
やるか、ガキども。
Envy's real form, ready to fight, is grotesque and almost like something out of a Berserk comic. Easily the most impressive visual in the story so far, I think. Outside of that impending fight, Arakawa is setting up the pieces of this proverbial chessboard for later. The Alphonse storyline is taken to an admittedly very interesting direction when he demonstrates further growth by thinking on his feet, by being decisive, and actually convincing the impressionable Gluttony to bring him to his father, the supervillain behind all of this, the big bad that's aka his dad. This should be interesting. And secondly, we haven't seen him in a short while, but Mustang is currently walking into the lion's den, so to speak, without knowing any better. It's extremely tense as he returns to the government HQ to see if he can find out or confirm that Wrath is in fact Wrath. Tense because we know he's going in to inspect the authenticity of this certain rumor, but additionally tense because we know that Bradley suspects him already from earlier in the story, and a general drags Mustang into a meeting room with all the higher-ups to tell this joke that he was using to test the water, and he has to do it to Bradley's face. I mean, it's a terrific scene, but I was on the edge of my seat all throughout this thing. But the long story short is, he and Hawkeye are now essentially hostages of some sort. Envy versus Lynn and Edward. So what do you do when you're stuck in an infinite void and need to kill the time? Try to kill each other! The fight here confronts Edward with a lot of difficult decisions though. Puts him into a lot of compromising situations that Ling has to bail him out of until he can't any longer. But lying dazed on the floor, Ed recognizes a piece of rock next to him. Something we've all seen, but honestly, I didn't even really twig it. The piece that was missing from the ruin he saw back in the desert. That's a really cool catch. And furthermore, the revelation that Envy is composed of all the civilians that lived in that ghost town, Xerxes, and capital A-N-D, and was the one who started the Civil War by killing that little kid, actually rocked my ever-loving world when I read it. Like, I have no idea why I never suspected that before. Shapeshifting and pretending to be different people and creatures has literally been Envy's entire MO and gimmick up until now. I feel like the biggest idiot for not guessing that earlier, but Arakawa, nice going. And this isn't even the wildest part. Edward opens up the same sort of portal he did before, and in the process, sees Al's body. And that might be the wildest scene I think the story has ever delivered for me. I got literal chills reading that. And I'm serious, it doesn't end there because my theory was ruined. Again in the same video, I know, whatever, okay? It's a trend right now. Fullmetal Alchemist, you beat me, okay? Whatever. Remember I said that Hoenheim was the big bad behind all of this? Well, it turns out he's not, apparently.
it's the evil twin brother with no memory of who their father is. He just so happens to look like Hoenheim and just so happens to have comparable powers, I guess. Okay, I have honestly no idea what's going on anymore. Ed, Lynn, and Envy come exploding out of gluttony because that's cool. Not Hoenheim somehow heals Edward with some sort of divine magic and manifests another hand out of literally nowhere for Al. Like, where does he get the material? Why can he do all of this without so much as moving a muscle? And the way with which this dude talks, like, he talks as if he was a god talking to insects. Meanwhile, we get a short cutaway to Hoenheim for Arakawa to rub it into my wound right now because he's hiking up the mountains for some specific reason that I have no idea about. I mean, is he responsible for creating this person? I mean, maybe. Is he a person? I'm not even sure. I'm over 50 chapters deep and I am literally more confused now than when I first started. Like, Hoenheim in the mountains, not the one in the creepy underground bunker, but the one in the mountains, who knows that something massively dangerous is happening. I mean, he warned Pinako about this. I mean, like, that's that massive event where their town is trapped in some transmutation circle. I mean, so surely he must be in on it, right? Like, guys, I'm genuinely at a complete loss here. This might be the very first time a story has completely stumped me. My theory is out the window and I feel nothing but failure and sadness. Naturally, because all of that shock and, you know, him threatening Lynn's life because he's, quote, unimportant, Ed jumps into action against Envy. I love the contrast, by the way, we see here between Ed with conviction in this scene versus Envy, and Ed without conviction versus Envy. You know, in the depths of gluttony, he lost the will to fight, and it was reflected in how he fared against the homunculi. But here, he seems to be less concerned with Envy, and more so this dude who totally isn't his dad. And he fares much better. That is, until he turns off his transmutation powers. Seriously, the more I read, the more confused I'm becoming. And now he's turning Link into New Greed. This is the single most insane chapter. My little heart can't take it. The only thing that would make this more insane would be if Scar were to show up. Oh, hey, look, it's the little girl with the panda bear that I've neglected to mention properly up until now. But check this out, right? So Scar comes to the rescue, so he's sort of like the anti-hero meets the heroes to fight against some common enemy type of guy. And he even has one of those moments where the anti-hero is all like, maybe we aren't so different after all, in his head. He says that in his head. And then throws Al's head at a pipe to make the chimeras explode. Okay, I explained that poorly, but I don't care. I want to go back to reading more.
Wait, is that it?
Did Mark just leave the video without a conclusion?
What's the conclusion? What do we do?
What do we do then?
And we're back. One thing I would like to know actually is whether or not at this point in the story, did anime only fans know that Hoenheim was actually some superpowered dude and could tank like 10 bullets to the chest like they were nothing? I mean, I think from the stuff I covered last week, that has to be the wildest scene. How could the anime skip that scene? It seems really important. Like, surely they must have replaced it with something afterwards to clue the audience in, right? So yeah, please, if anyone has any answers to this question, let me know in the comments down below. With that aside, we open this week with a tense scene, one where King Brad confronts Mustang, Al, and Ed over being exposed as a big, dumb, tattoo eye-having bad guy. But what struck me as the most creepy aspect was how calm the atmosphere was. Edward was allowed to mouth off and diffuse any and all tension with humor. It feels as though there's a sense that Ed is in control at times, or at the very least, isn't as concerned as he should be. That is until Bradley reveals the ace up his sleeve, one that again harkens back to a bunch of volumes prior when he had a private conversation with Winry. He's been so far ahead of the game, it's nuts to think about. And now, to keep Ed and Co in line, Winry's safety is threatened if they don't cooperate, so not great. That actually surprised me massively, and thankfully, nothing happens to the little girl. However, what it did bring to the focus is that there are some things that these guys will inevitably be unable to account for, and that's the cunning of the hero's side. And one character embodies this more than any other in my book, particularly in this section, and he was my favorite from last week's material. And man, does he pull one out of the hat here this week to get a message out despite not actually being in control. This is such a cool idea, and God, I love Ling. Like, this was such a smooth move, and it creates a wonderful tension around the new greed and how he might be compromised by Ling moving forward. This, I am certain, will lead to some amazing swerves at the final hour later on. It's got surprise bait written all over it. But I think from this early portion of this week's material, my main point of focus has to be on a throwaway line by some of the townsfolk Ed helps out later on. They mentioned that the other alchemists sent earlier couldn't transmute anything to help them fix the town. It claimed that correlated with the exact moment Ed had his powers taken away by Pipe Man. I actually don't know what his name is. What is his name? What do people call him? Father. Okay, yeah, taken away by Father. Alright, that sounds kind of kinky, but whatever.
Oh, kinky!
And so, that made me wonder, is this dude a literal god? Is Father a god? There was some exposition earlier alluding to the position for alchemy being similar to that of prayer. And this Father figure can turn off the transmutation powers of everyone, not just those he chooses. Why does he look like Hoenheim? This all makes no sense to me. I'm really left scratching my head with this one, guys. I mean, I have no idea what's going on. However, this isn't the part I alluded to in my intro. Instead, it's the material contained within Volume 15. It's deeply troubling, deals with some very serious subject matter. It's very much loosely inspired by real-life events that Arakawa researched and interviewed former vets for. This is the origin of the story itself and the foundations Fullmetal Alchemist as a story are built upon. Told through the perspectives of both Scar to Marco as well as Hawkeye to Edward upon request, the curtain is finally pulled on the troubling past as we're hurled years and years into the Ishvalan Civil War. I'm very much a fan of getting a chance to see the past Civil War that acts as a backdrop to all the story that's taken place. It's great to see scenes with Winry's parents and getting to see where she got her healing hands from. Being a mechanic in this day and age may as well be a doctor to her friends and clients at this point. Now, I want to make clear that I do love this section, and I mean love this section with a capital L, and I will explain why in just a moment, but I do have one issue with it. And while it is a nitpick, I will say this isn't the first time Arakawa has taken this approach and had the same narrative issue. Like I said moments ago, this is a story told from the points of view of Hawkeye predominantly, and that's the problem. The fact that this is presented through flashbacks from individual perspectives. There are certain scenes where I was left wondering how Hawkeye or even Marco were aware of the details concerning certain important and pivotal conversations they otherwise had no information on. We see scenes where the High Command strategize and discuss their evil schemes. It should be said that I'm perfectly happy with the information revealed. It's extremely interesting and engaging. My issue alone is with the clunky choice to present it in the flashback of a particular character that would have had no idea about these secrets and private conversations.
How did you know about the parts you weren't there for?
The World War II analog with the comparisons are very clear. From the brutal mistreatment of a race of people all the way to the medical experimentation on live human subjects. Even the flame alchemist of the past in a way feels like the creator of the atomic bomb. He created something spectacularly powerful, but in the process assured the deaths of millions with its very creation. There's a very interesting commentary here concerning the place of generational responsibility and the shouldering of atrocities in the name of potential future peace. It's a haunting concept and one I was thrilled to see explored in this volume. Our good friend Ron, like any bright-eyed youth unfamiliar with the horrors of humanity, trusts in his abilities to leverage this power for good. He didn't want to bring destruction, but unity to this world. From the perspective of Scar, I think this story succeeds in painting a very grim image of war and presents the perfect setup for Scar's inevitable revenge story. Unlike Ed, Scar is the concerned and scared younger of two brothers, with his older brother, due to his love for his family, electing to replace Scar's severed arm that he lost in combat with his own. Thematically, this is quite powerful and visually communicates that very theme effectively. Through saving Scar's life, his older brother sacrificed himself. Awakening on the table of Winry's parents, following those horrific events, Scar is left with an arm that has only the power to deconstruct or destroy. It's a nice visual metaphor for the revenge lust a grief-stricken younger brother might feel when his family and people have been wrongfully ripped away from him. Young Ron, despite getting the powers he was so convinced he could change the world with for the better, sees himself burdened instead with an immeasurable responsibility and a death toll he wasn't prepared to shoulder. Everything in this section shows the naivety of the youth and the death the older generations bring with them for these people to endure. The utter indifference of it all that they feel. With the best quote from this section being from Ron Mustang himself. He says, "You say I'm an idealist, but unless someone chases after pipe dreams, nothing will change."
Oh, actually, you know what? I made a mistake. You see, I said Scar shared his story, but in actuality, it wasn't him, but it was Dr. Marco informing Scar of what happened back during that time of the Civil War. The reason I was so confused by this was because we see Scar's entire backstory in the manga, for which Dr. Marco would have absolutely no clue about, yet somehow we see it. Firstly, I do want to say, however, that as a story and flashback, these sequences work remarkably well and are fantastically engaging. This is one of my favorite sections of the entire story. But the framework of this flashback, the logic of who's telling this story and from what perspective, just makes absolutely no sense at all. Interestingly, the Brotherhood anime actually fixes that flashback issue with Scar, instead showing us this portion of Scar's backstory when he's faced with the gun from Winry a while back. So I guess it's important to remember that 100% authenticity to the manga can be a bad thing. I've been reading this story for the first time alongside one of my friends, and together we're trying to predict who Pride will eventually be revealed as. At one point, my friends seemed to be convinced that it was this Kimberly dude. He did seem like an obvious candidate. He killed more people with a smile on his face than what many might conceive as normal, but I do, however, think it can't be him. From a narrative and framing standpoint, it makes little sense, to me at least, for him to be Pride. Though I will say, not impossible, of course. Something this story is trying to do is taunt and tease us into guessing who Pride is. He's being consistently out of frame during any and all interactions he participates in, and so I'm convinced it's going to be someone we least expect. And that means, in my mind, someone on the side of good. The more convinced we are in their innocence, the better, and more surprised we'll ultimately be. So I thought to myself, who are the candidates? And 3 names came to mind. Well, okay, technically 4, but I'm less sure of the last one. Dr. Knox is my first guess. Admittedly, I don't actually think this is very likely. He goes way back with everyone, has the trust of Mustang, and has ties to the military in some shape and form. He'd be a useful pawn and source of information, but yeah, I'm not convinced it's him. He seems extremely genuine. But if not him, how about Dr. Marco? As you can see, I don't much trust the doctors. This is the person I am least sure of, and honestly, is more a shot in the dark than anything else. Seeing as Marco's identity has already been compromised before, and in order for it to be him, Arakawa would have needed to have been playing the long con even when main story characters weren't looking. And to be honest, that seems kind of cheap, and I honestly don't think it's what she would do. Next up, Hawkeye. Hawkeye is getting a lot of screen time right now, lots of time in front of her eyes, and we've been bonded to her specifically. Honestly, I still think this one is a long shot. I give it like a 20% success rate, but my final pick, I am 40% sure it could be her. Maria Ross. How perfect would it be for her to be someone that's been close to the action since day one? How fortunate is it that she's been effectively written off the story? I think there's a decent chance it could be her, and that her framing was all a ploy to get the traitors of the military to reveal themselves. But we shall see how right, or more likely, how extremely wrong I am. Also, another long shot. Falman, he just got transferred up north. That becomes important later. And yeah, maybe maybe Hayate, the dog. God, I mean, the dog is like, I feel like that's a genius pick. If it's the dog, man, that would be an amazing shot in the dark. But yeah, anyway, back to the story.
Fullmetal Alchemist.
If nothing else, what Kimberly demonstrates is that the Philosopher's Stone allows those who wield it to, in some way, bypass equivalent exchange. Could this be the reason why Father was able to do the same and manifest what he needed for Al? Perhaps he's not a god, but in fact a delusional old man holding a gross, bloody stone. And honestly, as I look at him growing gluttony on his chest like a mother with an infant at her bosom, I can't help but feel like I don't have even enough information to know for certain, or make an educated guess for that matter.
軍事国家時代の海を全て絞り出さないと、この国は新しくならない。
Aside from that, there are some great contrasts made between the prior generation and the current older ones, with those like Hawkeye, Armstrong, and Mustang expressing a clear willingness to absorb the depressing situation before them, walk through a river of blood and corpses, all in the name of peace for the future generations to come. There's a very strong anti-war message in this volume that manages to say what it wants without feeling pretentious or like it's oversimplifying the greater issue. At the beginning of volume 15, Arakawa wrote, "In researching this volume, I interviewed veterans who had been at the front during World War II. I read countless books, examined film footage, and listened to many detailed and intense stories firsthand. But the one comment that affected me the most came from a former soldier who lowered his gaze to the tabletop and said, 'I never watch war movies.'" War is an extremely complicated situation and topic to tackle, and as a writer I think it's tantalizing to want to preach and tell your own story and perspective, but instead Arakawa wrote from the life experiences of those she's interviewed, built a world that reflected that and populated it with characters that she could then speak for, react how they would react, perform how they would perform, and feel how they would choose to cope. But in the pits of despair, she offers us a shining light at the end as the new generations offer hope for the future. And whether it be naive and idealistic wishes or stern conviction, it's comforting to see that even those ill-equipped idealistic trainee soldiers manage to find the resolve necessary to survive and not get lost in the past acts that they were once instructed to commit. It's a similar situation in philosophy that Edward finds himself in and employs regularly to this day. Move forward with a great dream for the future. Don't focus on your failings, or all you will contribute is failure.
何かあるんだ。あの二人の錬金術に。はあ、まだまだどん詰まりじゃないぜ。
While Volume 15 was crammed full of juicy material, Volume 16 comparatively takes its time and is a volume that consists of largely setup, establishing three clear parties that are all going to converge. Ed and Al looking for the little girl with the weird panda bear thing, so they can learn that purification alchemy to better deal with that father guy down the road. Group number 2 is Scar, now accompanied by the man he sprung from captivity, Dr. Marco, along with that little girl that they are after. They are now heading north for where Scar stashed his older brother's research. And finally, Kimberly, the most sadistic killer in this story, established perfectly during the last volume. He is released from prison in an effort to bolster the side of evil, sent on a mission north to take out Scar. Truth be told, this very much feels like a very distinct and different section of the story to anything else revealed to us thus far. Not just how it's structured in being this cat and mouse trifecta of possibilities, heroes, antagonists, and anti-heroes, but just as crucially in how the entire section is catered to by its environment. However, this doesn't mean that we are entirely leaving behind Central City. Far from it. Mustang will of course continue his under-the-radar quest for resources, leads, and allies while all of this is going on, but what I will say is that so much of this story has seen these characters color the pages of rolling fields or confined city landscapes like this, and naturally this made a lot of sense and I'm not complaining about it in the slightest. But what I am thrilled about concerning this local shift is how different its environment allows the story to feel.
どうした？バカにあたい。
The way this Briggs fortress is designed, characterized, and led in the manga is spectacularly distinct to anywhere else we've seen up until now. Everything from the environment to the challenges that creates and the temperament of the soldiers and leaders in this barracks all complement each other, creating wonderful new opportunities for tension. Major General Armstrong is one such character that embodies this setting. Cold, calculated, and stern, she and her loyal soldiers survive here because of their trust and respect for one another, which ends up proving to be their most valuable quality when Kimberly is released from prison and makes his way north in pursuit of Scar. The scene where these two eventually meet on the train is framed very dramatically in the manga, and honestly, I thought this was going to be some very action-packed fight. And while there is action in it, once again Arakawa undercuts the moment with an opportune dose of reality, bringing to light how out of shape Kimberly must have been in comparison to Scar, who's been fighting all of these years. And the results speak for themselves. Kimberly being brought to hospital with a big wound, but ultimately comes into contact with HQ and eventually into the fortress where Edward and Al arrive thanks to the use of his Philosopher's Stone. But not before Edward and Al and the fortress itself is infiltrated suddenly by an unknown enemy. Now, I'm not gonna lie, when this dude erupted from the floor beneath, two things ran through my head. One, who the hell is that and why are they tunneling?
The answer to those questions will be answered right now.
I quickly realized that I had in fact, for a split second before, been introduced to Sloth long ago. As an enemy, he offers a thrilling new challenge ripe with possibilities with him being a de facto armored tank with quite literally no brain power at all. Direct attacks won't work, fire won't work, and so the forces of Briggs along with Armstrong work together to push the beast outside into the freezing tundra. It's a moment of strategic genius in my opinion, and once again leverages what makes this area that much more interesting and unique in the first place. And through exploring the seamlessly endless tunnel this creature created, Armstrong, in all her gorgeous, beautiful, strategic wisdom, uses this as an opportunity to entice the up until now tight-lipped Elric brothers into spilling the beans on what exactly they haven't been telling her about High Command and these tunnels. But in summation, they are all linked to other key points of the surrounding area where prior battles or civil wars had been raged, making for a enormous transmutation circle. It's here all the pieces fall into place and we're once again told what Hughes died for uncovering. From there, they formulate a measured and subtle plan of attack. God, I love this character. She is incredibly resourceful and measured with every move she takes. And even later in moments where Ed and Al overextend themselves or have to think on the fly, her situation is always the most stable thanks to her initial approach. God, I am so happy she's on our side.
And now for something completely different.
I think it's fair to say at this point that with every consecutive scene Hoenheim participates in, I have less of an understanding of what exactly is going on here. He's like anti-exposition. He's like ants for my brain. I don't know, I'm bad with words. And moreover, my theory about Hoenheim is entirely dead in the water now. He does seem to be immortal and as a result thinks of himself as a monster, so much so that he doesn't want to touch his children for fear that it might infect them with some sort of curse that he has perhaps. Then he leaves for research. Trisha dying from a sickness seems oddly convenient now at this point, but who knows for sure? I mean, things regarding this particular storyline have been so crazy, I'm honestly willing and waiting for him to take off a mask and be all like, "It was me, Austin! It was me all along!" And you know what? If that did happen, it wouldn't be the weirdest thing Hoenheim has done. And just to throw more fuel on the fire that was my brain at this point, this happens.
Fullmetal Alchemist.
There's a wonderful sense of camaraderie in the Briggs fortress, and when the soldiers go down into the tunnel where the other soldiers disappear to save them, the coming scenes and setting is horrific. This entire section has a real sense of fear and horror. I'm a massive fan of the cold as a horror setting. The restrictions it puts on the situation and its characters is perfect for this sort of tale. Everyone is trapped inside this fortress, monsters beneath them, deathly cold outside, and enemies all around. It's such a wonderfully tense and brilliantly executed context for the main characters to be contained within, particularly now that Winry is here. And then, of course, the story proves me wrong yet again.
私の名はプライド始まりのホンクルス
Now, I want to make one thing perfectly clear so I'm not a complete and total failure in your eyes. While I didn't predict this kid was Pride even one chapter before he was revealed to be the OG homunculus, I did predict it was him at the last possible moment where I can say I somewhat predicted it. And it's all because of the words his mother chose to describe him at the beginning of this scene. When she said he was, quote, her pride and joy. I was like, "Ooh, there's the little bastard!"
your theory is...
But then immediately after, I'm like, damn it, they revealed it right away. All my predictions were wrong again. I really thought I was onto something with the dog. That would have been hilarious and honestly kind of genius, and I'm proud that I guessed that. But the kid being Pride here works too, I guess. He's the first homunculus, and he's surrounded by the darkness that killed those soldiers in the tunnel, so I guess now we know how they died. But interestingly, on the topic of Pride's revelation, apparently 1 year before Pride's identity was ever revealed, someone actually guessed who it was. It's a very interesting read. I highly recommend it. The conversation, or should I say confrontation, between Kimberly and Edward is fantastic. It's a perfect example of rising tension and stakes as Kimberly reveals what he wants Edward to do. Ed refuses naturally and asks why he does what he's doing if he's not a homunculus. And through that disclosure, we learn just how twisted and cruel Kimberly actually is. Like a Goebbels from Hitler's ranks. Someone that can get things done and isn't afraid, or should I say morally bankrupt and insane enough, to get his hands dirty. And that's when everything Ed has ever wanted is dangled right in front of him. The answer to his quest for his brother's body, his arm, his leg, the answer to everything they've been seeking together. The Philosopher's Stone is offered to him for his cooperation. And now he has to decide what is more important, what he wants or his morals. This is a textbook example of what a villain can offer a hero in a story. It exposes the villain's true nature and taunts the hero away from what makes them just. I love moments like this because it really establishes the difference between the two characters involved and exposes who they really are, for better or for worse. And later, once Ed, Al, and Winry fake agree to help Kimberly search for Scar, another opportunity presents itself for Winry to reveal who she really is. Upon finding and cornering Scar following a Chimera attack, in a similar fashion to how Ed and Al were handed everything they wanted on a silver platter with Kimberly, so too is Winry in this situation. Restrained in front of her, she confronts him, and instead of succumbing to her darker feelings concerning him, she uses her healing hands not to hurt him, but instead bandage up his wounds. And right after this is yet more fuel for a wacky theory of mine. If negative feelings build up, the flow of the world will become negative. On the other hand, it's possible to accumulate positive feelings and make the world flow in a positive direction once again. This is a very interesting choice of words recalled back to by Scar that his older brother said to him. A quote that in my mind maps onto the sort of alchemy or purification arts May and her culture has become proficient using. This idea that her power comes from the flow of energy in the earth, it makes me wonder if this story is framing the sort of alchemy Edward, Mustang, and Al use as that of negativity. It's a tool of war used by the dogs of the military, used to harness power for violent ends, whereas the purification arts are derived specifically from medicine, used to help and to heal people. And so I wonder if this negativity that's being sown through constant war, hatred, racism, and revenge by the forces of evil, I wonder if it bolsters their power, while the decisions Edward and Winry made in this volume, like not accepting to use something so morally reprehensible like the Philosopher's Stone, or simply enduring and breaking the cycle of hatred in Winry's circumstance, is the greater theme of the story. To not take the easy way out for one's own selfish desires, but to instead go that extra mile because it's the right thing to do. So much of what General Raven depends on when trying to convince Armstrong is her ego. He tries to prey on her fear of aging, her material or selfish desires, and expressly points out that there will of course need to be sacrifices. Sacrifices he is okay with because he specifically is one of the chosen few that will reap the rewards and not any of the negatives. But yeah, that's just my theory here and now. Alright, so this looks bad, and it is, but not for the reasons one might initially think. And I love that about this story. However, this also marks the last time Ed will see his brother until
the Day of Reckoning.
And truth be told, while things are still falling into place even this far out, I must say I am extremely excited for what will be the final video in this series next week. But before we get to the
Day of Reckoning,
Okay. Before I move on to that material, we first need to set this chessboard up. And there's some amazing stuff. I think my favorite part about this remaining section is the level of covert ops, assumptions, and risks the hero side needs to rely on to advance in any small way they can. Arakawa has done a fantastic job of spreading all the key characters all over the map, quite literally, and as a result, we have so many unlikely scenarios and team-ups. For instance, I get the feeling at this point that Arakawa wants to separate Edward and Al before they inevitably reunite at the end of the story and embrace all lovey-dovey. But in order to do that, she needs a just cause, and man, the justification she comes up with is again simple, but utterly genius. We all know Scar is taking Winry in this instance because it takes her quite literally out of a hostage situation, and Ed is hoping that Kimberly will buy this, but unfortunately he doesn't, and in fact he's already sent central goons all over Fort Briggs where her, Scar, and the rest of Team Hero are heading, and so because they need to be warned and no one can go outside in this blizzard, Al is sent because he can't feel the cold. He's the only one that can do it. And that's brilliant, and it creates the necessary distance between the two main characters. It's a goated decision, and on top of that, this happens. And I know what you're thinking. You're right, I don't know what that means. You're catching on, but thankfully Arakawa is a gracious god and bestowed upon me the greatest gift this story can bestow, understanding, because we finally get context for Hoenheim, or should I say, slave number 23. I think if you left me with this story up until now for a dozen years, I wouldn't have ever guessed that he was a living Philosopher's Stone. I would never have put those pieces together, and I would never have put him and the lost city of Xerxes together at all, let alone that he was once upon a time with all the sins. That said, it does all make sense now, but perhaps my favorite aspect of this flashback and greater conflict comes from something that was said about humankind in general. Man, in this section, is described as having all of the 7 deadly sins inside of them, and that those sins all play a role in carving out the terrible situations the world is facing today. And this very much feels like a real-life commentary Arakawa is making on modern society in general. Alright, so this fight scene, it's spectacular, and it's great in my mind for one specific reason. This will sound really random as hell, but trust me, I'll bring it back again to Fullmetal Alchemist. I love all aspects of this story that rely on the mechanics that grant it novelty. So what do I mean by that? Well, in 2016, a film called Sing, produced by Illumination Entertainment, reminded me of how crucial this quality Fullmetal Alchemist has. This is a film, Sing, that quite literally did not need to design animals as the main characters in order for the film to work. And in my mind, that's a problem. In fact, them being animals and not utilizing that not only makes their appearance entirely pointless, but leaves so much on the table for exploration that it's frustrating. On the flip side, if you look at a film like Zootopia, which came out that same year, the characters being animals is quite literally integral to the plot. The story itself wouldn't make sense without that aspect. And you might think that sounds like a weakness, but it's really not. It's a strength. Using elements of your story that make it unique, weaving it into the plot, not only gives your story a sense of identity, but also makes it that much more enjoyable and unique. There are a million stories like that which Sing demonstrates, but there are no stories like Zootopia, or in this case,
Fullmetal Alchemist.
Like, there's this battle that erupts once Kimberly outs himself as totally in the know regarding their ambush and sticks 2 chimeras on Ed. During this battle, Ed uses the very alchemy that makes this story unique to defeat the chimeras, by removing the ammonia from the sticks of dynamite he found around him. That is such a fun and inventive idea, but it's also an approach to combat literally no other story can do without straight up copying Arakawa's power system here. It's a great idea. This is exactly what I look for in a great fight, injecting elements that make the story unique and interesting. And on the topic of battle, something I noticed and haven't mentioned yet is that there are a number of instances where it would be convenient or expedient for Edward and Al to just kill their enemies and move on without a second thought. They are reminded time and again that that trait that they possess, that softness, will get them killed, that it's a weakness. And this can be reflected in how they try to bring the chimeras over to their way of thinking, but I genuinely think it's this philosophy that the older generation calls naive that will once and for all break the cycle of negativity, revenge, and violence that this land has endured for hundreds of years. If we care for everyone's well-being and even our greatest enemies, then there's truly hope for peace. And that is something more, infinitely more, than what prior generations have offered. However, that doesn't mean that along the way there won't be some truly devastating speed bumps. This freaked me the hell out. As Ed discovers how massively injured he is, I'm reminded that this is the first major time his physical human body has sustained any significant damage. And at that very moment, Al falls to the ground. I guess their theory about Edward and Al being tied together is true in some way. In addition to that, Hoenheim delivers a message to Pride for father, which is pretty cool. Kimberly decides to bring the Drachma army to the door of Fort Briggs, what a Chad, and Envy is tipped off to the whereabouts of Winry and co, which would be all fine, but for some reason, when I finished reading that last bit, closing volume 19 and opening volume 20 to start the next chapter, suddenly a mini time skip happens. The battle at Fort Briggs is over, Edward is fully healed, and Envy is already after catching up with Scar, Winry, and the rest. I found that a little jarring when I was reading, I won't lie, particularly because we already felt as though we were building up to a proper time skip, but yeah, I don't know. Did the anime do anything different? Did you guys feel this way around this section? Let me know in the comments. This is one of the coolest fight scenes, man. Like, again, using everything that makes the story unique, and it even managed to give Dr. Marco, everyone's favorite man on his knees crying, a chance to redeem himself in some capacity. And what a finish, like, holy hell! I mean, I love that they confuse Envy with this strange Zing alchemy, but when Marco revealed that he has a transmutation circle etched onto his palm and just blows the ever-loving poop out of Envy, leaving them as a shriveled up prune of a homunculus, I felt all sorts of catharsis. Or did I? So, as a quick break from the weird and terrible stuff in this video, there was one scene that actually got me to tear up a little bit. Or should I say, one line. It's a blink and you miss it moment, but it occurs between Rose and Winry when they first talk. And it's great.
エドが立ち上がるための足を作った人か。
This is a line that harkens back, for me, to the very first moment I really fell in love with this story. Back when Ed told Rose to pick herself up and said that she should be grateful that she has two strong legs that can lift her up and take her to where she needs to be, I didn't realize then how much a sentence like that would mean in the broader context of this story, and in many ways, it reminded me quite a lot of a similar moment that occurs in Berserk towards the end of its very first arc. And it just goes to show once again that the healing hands, the kindness that so many might color in the older generation as weakness, can not only change the quality for one person's life, but as Rose says, can indirectly save the lives of hundreds, maybe even thousands. That's a brilliant moment, and one that Arakawa really brought to life in just one short sentence. It's beautiful. And oh yeah, here's an army of creepy, lifeless dolls. Yeah, that's not good. But you know what is good? Greed. But okay, not literally, but okay, the person. And I'm so happy because, like, I was always a fan of Greed, the character, not the thing, yeah, the character. Even on day one, I was a fan of him. I was all in on this character. Loved his vibe, but then he died. Big sad, right? But now he's back with his original memories and full-blown anti-hero. There's an absolutely epic conversation or confrontation between Greed and Edward that takes place right at the end of volume 20, and in it, as a really nice contrast to Greed and Edward's last encounter, where Ed absolutely disregarded any and all consideration of working with him, right now Ed puts his pride to the side and agrees to be his henchman, lowering himself. And the quotes, man, the quotes are fantastic. Greed says, "Are you sure you won't regret it?" meaning this decision, to which Ed responds, "Don't insult me. My whole life's been a lesson on regret." Man, I just love this story. I love these characters, and right now, all of them are spread out across the world, the map of this world that Arakawa has built for us, readying themselves to come together for that fabled Day of Reckoning. I don't think a story has made me feel this way before. Behind me, as many of you know, is a bookcase filled with, frankly, far too many manga. Stories that artists and writers have dedicated their lives to telling. They are the result of thousands of hours of blood, sweat, and tears being poured into a passion project the likes of which neither I nor those who are even long-time fans can truly fully appreciate. When I started to review other series on this channel outside of Dragon Ball, I preemptively purchased a host of other popular series and since then have expanded my collection to include even more. This is all to say that for years, this story, Fullmetal Alchemist, has just been sitting behind me, waiting for me to finally find the time to give it the attention that it deserved. And now, having finally closed the book on the final chapter of this breathtaking series, I find myself now glancing behind me more and more at the stories I've yet to read, thinking just how many of these are hiding masterpieces beneath their covers. But I digress. How do I feel after having finished Fullmetal Alchemist? Did I think Hiromu Arakawa delivered a conclusion worthy of this exceptional and personal story? What did I think of Fullmetal Alchemist? What a question. I'm going to try my best to cover the final 7 volumes of manga I read this week to bring this series to a close in a satisfying fashion. And trust me, given the amount of material I have to cover this week, make sense of, break down, and give my thoughts on, it'll be a miracle if I do manage to make it to the finish line without missing something someone out there enjoys. This is to say that Fullmetal Alchemist isn't a trite or shallow work of art, but instead one that can be enjoyed by 100 different people in 100 different ways. And that's according to the author herself, so don't shoot the messenger. To tell you the truth, I've spent the last week contemplating how I want to express myself concerning this section of the story, this series, and specifically how it executed those last few chapters and how they made me feel. Oftentimes in these deep dives into a particular author's work, I like to dig into the backstory of the creator in question and see how their lives might have shaped the person they became and ultimately the story they decided to tell and craft. In the same way Naruto was inspired by Kishimoto's own life experiences and Hunter x Hunter at times might have been a reflection of Togashi's inner turmoil at the time, I think Fullmetal Alchemist is a projection of how a farm-loving country girl in northern Japan saw and interpreted the world. The more I read about this woman, the more I realized that she's an artist in the truest sense of the word. A student not just of drawing or traditional means, but of people. She understands people. She's the sort of person to recognize her own conviction and pursue a career writing shonen as a woman, something at the time and even today wasn't and still isn't considered commonplace. She's someone that wrote her story with a clear understanding that just like life, everyone who took the time to read this story will likely come away with their own unique impression, and she welcomed that. Much like the people of Jing in her story, she very much seems like the sort of person not to talk in absolutes but to feel the rhythm of the world or the pulse of her own story, allowing her characters to dictate the conclusions without having hardline bullet points she needed to hit. And it's that nuance that I believe takes this series from a great shonen story and elevates it to one of the very best of all time, without question. The 7 deadly sins of this story have been framed as villains from the very beginning, but in the end, they aren't. In fact, there really isn't any hardline villain or hero in this story beyond that of the struggle between virtue and selfishness. And on the topic of the sins or homunculi themselves, I very much liked how Arakawa has chosen to explore the nuances of them as not only characters but narrative devices themselves, not pushing the portrayal that they are absolute representations of evil in this world, but that they are a reflection of our humanity ourselves, that there are ways to express these desires in a positive fashion, proving that what makes human beings equal parts special, wonderful, and terrifying is that we all have the power to be evil or good if we so choose. Greed, as she points out, can be analogous to that of hope. Wrath can be channeled not to kill, but to instead incite change, etc. And it's that nuance that's permeated this story that has, in my opinion, elevated it beyond what it could have otherwise been. It's that realism, those dark undertones everyone loves in this story that I feel stand and speak to the themes Arikawa has been trying to implement and express throughout its runtime and page count.
Gluttony and pride versus everyone.
Within many other stories, this scene might be considered again one of the strongest scenes or fights offered in its production, but in Arikawa's Fullmetal Alchemist, it's just another day at the office. While this is a rather pivotal and intricate combat encounter for our heroes with some genuinely high stakes, it's worth mentioning that even the smaller scale encounters from this story have offered a host of heart and imagination, the likes of which I never expected before picking this series up. Contained within this fight, while there are certainly very obvious badass offerings such as Al being manipulated like a puppet by pride as a reunification of the two brothers, the nighttime setting offering a host of unique opportunities to use lesser known skills like Ling popping out of greed to say hi, and of course, the lion dude. And who could forget this? This has to be like the single most edgy and cool design in the entire manga, and you know, I'm here for it. While all of those more obvious aspects are of course there, and I'm certain millions have already spoken about them at length already, I feel drawn to other areas, like Gluttony's last words being that of lust. And looking back on this material now for the purposes of this video, after having finished reading, I'm happy I took that note because it all matches something I noticed much later in the story. That father, okay, I can't keep calling this guy father, that feels way too pretentious, so I noticed that Daddy assembled a family of homunculi. Gluttony's affinity for lust and her relationship with him feels like that of a mother and son. Pride quite obviously is another kid. Wrath is either a father figure or a weird evil uncle. Envy and greed are clearly teenagers. Heck, Greed's last words allude to him exhibiting teenage angst, and Sloth is the dog? Okay, I don't know, with that one it kind of falls apart, but I like to think something like this was intentional. As we continue on into volume 22 with this fight, I noticed something that I almost missed when I was reading through it the first time. And that thing was this wonderful touch Arikawa added to Greed's dialogue. You might have noticed that every time Ed refers to one of the two chimeras in his stead, he calls them either Lion Guy or Gorilla Man or something like that. No matter what, he never calls them by their real names, and honestly, at that point in the story, even I, who takes notes, didn't recall their names either. We just didn't think of it as, important. However, and this is gorgeously subtle, Greed, despite being a debaucherous, outspoken blowhard, doesn't call them fake or derogatory names. Every single time, he refers to them by their real names. This creative choice, when you focus on it, almost feels like it's out of character for Greed, until you realize that, in reality, it's pointing out that Greed isn't being entirely authentic with what he truly wants. It's a wonderfully subtle indication of where his true values as a character lie, and where his story will ultimately take him. I love this creative choice with a capital L. It's just perfect. Chef's kiss! Hoenheim and Al's plan is equally amazing. Al is an absolute savage here, using himself as live bait to trap Pride inside the rocks with him. And over the last week, I think I've figured out what makes Al specifically engaging as a character for me. For as long as I can remember, I've been a fan of active characters. Characters like Luffy, Goku, Vegeta, Naruto, Eren from Attack on Titan. All natural leader types that take the story by the horns, control the narrative, and create interest for us as readers as a result. They all have wildly different but natural charismas. In other words, it's easy to enjoy those characters because when they are on screen, the story happens. Alphonse Elric is not an active protagonist, or at the very least, he's not a natural fit for one, I think. Edward so naturally fits this description, however. It's his will alone that has caused this entire mess, and he's even the reason Al is there in the first place the way he is. Time and again, he feverishly pushes, scratches, claws, and crawls towards his ultimate righteous goal. And while Al certainly helps him in whatever way he can, he's always been more inclined to worry about his brother and insist they rest or exercise caution in reaction to something or someone. He's a very natural, reactionary character, a very likable one. But why I like him as a character case study so much is because Arikawa has written him to be a reactionary character with a set of morals that forces him outside of his comfort zone to be active. Sort of like a reverse Eren Yeager from Attack on Titan, if you will, where Eren was as clear an active character as one could imagine, trapped in a world that reminded him time and again that he was powerless. Alphonse is such a soft, caring, gentle, and kind reactionary character, tailor-made for that role, who is also trapped in a world that forces him to consider his actions more closely, forcing him to take the initiative, and it's so damn cool to watch. And the plan they implement here in this section is just outstanding. This is a character that doesn't want anyone to get hurt or die on his behalf again, and he is willing to shred his body apart or separate himself from the group for as long as he's needed to, if it means he's contributing to the goal in a meaningful capacity to save others. He needs no food, no oxygen, so all he has to do is pretty much wait for the day of reckoning to pass now. It's a genius move on his part, I think, and even if it ultimately doesn't work out in his favor, with Pride using Morse code to contact Kimberly, what? Whatever. The scene still rules, and now we're headed into the big finale, as Team Mustang, aided by Rebecca, Maria Ross, and Havoc, all make their presence known in their own small ways. I'm thrilled that the moral of this story is not to let your darker nature overshadow the good that you can offer the world. It's of course already been pointed out in this story that in every human being there's the 7 deadly sins, of course, that we all fall prey to under the right and wrong circumstances. And I love that throughout this story there's been a consistent effort to not shy away from each individual exhibiting their own unique blend of either utilizing their sin for good or avoiding the darkness that they might flirt with entirely. We've seen greed used as a synonym for hope in many cases. We later watch as the pride of an entire civilization can be the source of unity in Hoenheim, and we see in the case of Al, slothfulness can also be seen as a willingness to rest and enjoy the moment free of stress. Alphonse has tried to help his brother unwind when he can, and it's wonderful to see. On the other hand, in the case of Havoc, he had every excuse to sit in his butt and just feel sorry for himself. To do so would be slothfulness taking over his life in a counterproductive way, and we see him push past that in this scene, helping the war effort, without which they would have just suddenly lost. This is all to say that this is such a stunningly told story, full of detail, nuance, and it's a joy to read. This is Alphonse's defining character moment, or at least the most demanding one he's ever encountered. In the past, I've spoken about how this story has presented Edward and Winry with circumstances that allow them to make a character-defining choice. A choice demonstrating who exactly they are when under extreme pressure. The bigger the antagonist and the easier the shortcut, the better. For Winry, it was deciding not to retaliate against Scar in violent manner, but to be true to her own healing nature. And for Ed, it was choosing not to take an easy but morally bankrupt road into achieving everything he's ever wanted. And in a completely different fashion to that which Ed found himself in, one of Kimberly's former henchmen, Heinkel, or Lion Man, offers Alphonse the stone. Not to manipulate him, but to instead simply survive. Instead of looking at this as a compromise, the Philosopher's Stone is presented as a potential source for good here. It's explained that these people trapped inside were unfairly sacrificed, and now, as Heinkel says, there's a chance to fight the same force that once took everything away from them through Alphonse, justice. And against all odds, in this desperate situation, Al moves forward and uses the power of the stone for the first and the very last time, resulting in one of the most astonishing fight sequences in this story, regardless of whether it's the manga or the anime. And while this courage and determination Alphonse demonstrates here will result in another reckless decision during the climax of this story in chapter 107, it also shows that this enormous power in the right hands can be used to protect and to heal. And that is exactly how Kimberly, the one who offered Ed that same Philosopher's Stone with evil intentions, is taken out by none other than his former subordinate Heinkel, now healed thanks to the power of that very stone. And as we continue reading, Mustang's forces aid in the support of the Armstrong agenda, and Hoenheim, Scar, Edward, and Lanfan all rush in to confront Daddy, until a teeny, tiny, small wrench gets thrown into the mix.
So yeah, look, these guys are all sorts of scary and unsettling, particularly when you consider their moans of the pleas for help from an entire group of people, young and old. So yeah, it's the stuff of nightmares. However, the implications are both better and much worse than we might consider upon their release in the story. There's a considerable amount of friendly fires here with these little foot soldiers eating up the higher-ups. But most importantly, concerning our main character, Edward, and his co-star, Scar, they're tasked with holding off these undead dolls, but narratively, to tell you the truth, these dolls are really just here to keep our heroes busy, waiting until they're ready to join what is possibly the best scene or conflict in the entire tale. It's easily one of the most cathartic fights I've read through in this story, and honestly, it might be the best part of it. And that might be contentious, but hear me out here. I can appreciate that given how many heart-wrenching and truly inspiring moments there are to come, many have their own impressions that count as the best, but I chose this because I honestly cannot remember the last time a series so perfectly subverted the genre it was housed within, using its own tropes, luring me in as a reader and forced me to learn the same lesson as the central character so effectively and succinctly. I am of course talking about Mustang versus a suddenly freed and re-energized Envy. I want to start off by addressing what I think is the weakest part of this entire encounter, and that's the naivety and gullibility this scene hinges on from May. I know, I don't dislike the character, and it's not like it doesn't make sense that she would be manipulated. It just always feels a little less clean of a narrative pull when we rely on a character's incompetence. Even if they are a child, and it does make sense, but if we excuse my disdain for the vertically challenged for just a moment, I want to closely examine what it is about this scene that I think is so damn effective. Once Envy eats all the one-ups in the surrounding area, and Mustang regroups by making the save on Edward and Scar, we finally get this confession once Envy is cornered. So much of what makes this scene work is rooted in character, concerning Mustang and his love for his friend, yes, but additionally our personal bond as readers to both Mustang and indeed the late Hughes, and it relies on our contempt for Envy. So much of the turmoil this character Mustang has faced has been due to the coercive and murderous actions of this homunculi, and just like anyone in his position, Mustang erupts with both figurative and literal fire. Mustang pursues Envy like a pyrotechnic Michael Myers. Envy tries to confuse Hawkeye, fails. Tries to prey on Mustang's emotions, fails. I cannot express just how cathartic this felt for me as a reader, for Envy to finally get what they deserve. Now, I'm about to make comparisons to other popular shonen works. By doing so, I'm not trying to suggest that one is better than the other or that Fullmetal Alchemist is objectively superior. What I want to do is establish a trend or expectation set up by prior shonen stories. Because so much of what makes shonen successful predicates on its ability to make us want to overcome that mountain to either gain retribution or, in this case, justice. Goku vs. Frieza establishes a villain that is truly reprehensible in every sense of the word, in the face of a hero that does not want to kill, but to instead best him. The villain pushes the hero past the point of no return when his best friend is killed before his very eyes, after which we as an audience thirst for Frieza's blood just like Goku does. And while the contest ends in Goku showing mercy ultimately, the final takeaway from this is that sometimes there are people that aren't capable of change. Individuals that ultimately lead to their own defeat through the choices they've made. And Dragon Ball is filled with these types of cathartic outbursts by a hero having to overcome and defeat or wipe out some kind of great evil. And look, it's not just Dragon Ball. Naruto has this, Hunter x Hunter has this, One Piece has this, and for good reason. It leverages a tribalistic tendency in each and every human being that reads the material. Of course we want retribution and justice for our lost friends, and the shonen genre has used this trait we all largely possess to grant us a wonderfully cathartic payoff. It creates an expectation Arakawa decided to subvert at the last possible moment. Like many watching this scene, while I was reading through this, I was thinking, yes, 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 destroy that envious bastard! In my mind, I'm thinking they deserve it, they are evil, they've caused so much trouble. And they even killed a character I personally loved in Hughes. For all intents and purposes, Mustang in this scene was exacting my revenge unto this character for me. And that's
when Arakawa reminds us of the themes she wishes to reinforce in this story. Shonen, yes, but with a healthy dose of reality and realism for good measure. And now we notice that Mustang, while acting as an arbiter of justice, is additionally consumed by lust for revenge and wrath. Edward doesn't want to lose his friend or rival to this darkness, and alongside Scar warns him that there's a line he's about to cross that he'll never be able to come back from. This is a wonderful subversion of how traditional shonen stories play out, and I think its dedication to the themes in favor of this less traditional approach made for me one of the most impactful scenes I've ever read. I just love that in the process of making their way to saving this country and the people inside of it, they are themselves the heroes, overcoming their own deadly sins that, as this story has already pointed out, are inherent to humankind. And watching as his dutiful and resolute subordinate in Hawkeye being the main player in lifting Mustang back from the brink, it's a wonderful contrast to the state she herself was in towards the story's beginning. So in addition to a wonderful subversion, this scene also acts partially as a payoff to 3 character arcs in Mustang, Hawkeye, and even Scar, who thinks to himself and alerts the group to this mistake. Though all of these characters still have more to offer in this department and story, and speaking of philosophy and themes, Hoenheim, who I will henceforth refer to as Ho-Ho, meets with Daddy one more time. They have a big long talk about ethics and other words I don't quite know how to define, but look, shh, my sweet, it is not yet time to talk about Ho-Ho or his daddy scene. Oh, a tank. That's pretty great. And look, what's that? It's Alex Armstrong and his sister Olivier? That sounds like a boy's name.
That's a girl's name.
And they are facing none other than the brawn of the homunculi faction, the big old tired boy himself. We're talking about Sloth. The fight here is pretty much the 2 Armstrong siblings flexing what makes them great characters, with Olivier. Really hope I'm pronouncing that right. With Olivier, it's her strategy, cool-headedness, and determination on display. With Alex, it's his compassion and latent ability once he's fully focused. And honestly, I don't know what else to say to you guys other than I just really enjoy this fight scene. I thought that the way that they struggled against Sloth was compelling, and honestly, when it came to how Alex rose to the occasion while his sister was injured, it was just icing on this wonderfully constructed action cake. And with that, the Briggs forces along with Armstrong have taken control of Squad A and C in Central. And in addition to that, Izumi helps them finish off Sloth with her husband. Great stuff. And as a quick side, I always found Sloth to be kind of hilarious. Like, he might have the funniest death in the entire series, like, oh no, I can't go on, it's too much effort to live. I mean, that's kind of relatable. And talking about how tiring life is, this dude just gives off the same energy as this girl.
People always ask me where I see myself in 10 years. Like, buddy, I'm just trying to make it to Friday.
And in hindsight, Sloth might have been my favorite after Greed for that very reason. Sloth went too soon. And with him, Envy and a host of others now out of the picture, it seems the forces of good are all successfully congregating in this one location to fight for the greater good. It's a wonderful feeling, but if I know anything for one, I know stories. And this is setting up the hope necessary for us to feel as readers it all be torn away suddenly. And in the process, I'm sure Arakawa will reveal just how powerful and in control the villain is before the big finish or something. I know this is going to happen, based on convention, but I am still, oh so excited to experience this regardless. The magic of great storytelling. Arakawa, take my money!
Just take all my money! Oh, not this soon! Not this soon!
Fullmetal Alchemist.
自分の城に入るのに裏口から入らねばならぬ理由があるのかね?
This is not the face that I wanted to see now, or so I thought. Little did I know, I definitely knew, but little did I know that this was the setup to yet more peak combat for one of the best writers in the industry, Arakawa. And just like I predicted moments before reading it, this dude takes all the advancements and successes the forces of good have achieved in his absence, and with a few swipes of his sword, he totally wrecks the tank on his own and offers more pressure than the entire Central forces combined. And on top of all of that, in the middle of fighting Wrath, Buccaneer just gets defeated. Take a big old nap on the floor, my sweet prince.
I didn't hear no bell.
But okay, look, I've been kidding around, but it's time to get serious because, unironically, I adored reading through this fight scene. And why? Because my boy, or should I say, boys here, Greed and Ling, doing their thing. I've said it before, but I'm a sucker for a great anti-hero, and in the end, Greed continues to redeem himself as he does battle with Wrath. But Wrath is honestly next level, and that's when Fu enters the chat. Now look, there's some back and forth here, yes? Does Fu get to exercise some anger towards the man that took his daughter's arm? Yes. Does Greed show some awesomeness? Of course he does. But look, this fight for me peaks at one moment, or should I say an avalanche of story beats that clutter towards the end. And it all starts when Fu takes a death blow from Wrath. Like, it's getting super serious now. One of the main side characters is now definitely not going to make it, and in response to this, Greed actually loses control of the body that he's possessing, and Ling erupts back into control. And once again, mirroring his last encounter with Wrath, crouches before him, clutching at his loved one to protect them. Again, unlike Bradley, he's someone that's never going to turn his back on his people. Never. And that's when the unthinkable happened. And really, it shouldn't have been unthinkable. I should have seen it coming. But this is just one of those stories that gets me swept away, and that's really rare for me. For a story to get me to leave analytical mode for a second, or even for a scene, is a testament to how well constructed it truly is. But I digress. Fu knocks out Ling, freeing up Greed to once again take control. Fu pleads with him to harden and to protect his prince as he reveals dynamite hidden beneath the garb that he's wearing as he charges towards Wrath head on. I'm sorry, but can we talk about how great a scene that is? Alright, so things are going down now. Daddy has his eyes on Ho-Ho. Ed, Mustang, Hawkeye, Scar all arrive at the foot of the man who created Bradley in the first place, this weird, creepy doctor, and all the pieces are now set for the final confrontation to end all confrontations, it seems. And while I will be covering that in just a moment, I want to, before we move on, give credit to the people who helped to make this story and the one that came before, oh, so memorable. It's time to dive into the production and the people behind Fullmetal Alchemist 2003 and Brotherhood. The anime adaptations. In part 1 of this review series, I spent time introducing the upper echelon of both the Fullmetal Alchemist animes, touching on the sheer number of high-quality outsourcing studios involved, along with Bones' background in robust mecha animation, leading to both series featuring remarkable model consistency. But of course, it's not buildings that make anime, it's people, and there are some key players that helped elevate both series to insane heights. In 2003's anime, the most exceptional talent on board is a name that has become synonymous with Sakuga, a name that even those only with a passing interest in animation know. It is, of course, Yutaka Nakamura. Over the past 2 decades, Yutaka Nakamura has cemented himself as the father of modern action animation. In my Mob Psycho 100 review, I noted that whether you know him by name or not, you've no doubt seen him in shows like My Hero Academia and One Punch Man, and going back further will open you up to his iconic Cowboy Bebop work. Nowadays, you may well have seen scenes you thought were him, but were in fact just inspired by his style. Those pencil impact frames and cubes are so iconic and so copied these days. In 2003's Fullmetal Alchemist anime, he actually joined the production late compared to his peers. At the time, he was busy with an anime called Wolf's Rain, and while his work there was solid, it was nothing compared to what he was about to produce for Fullmetal Alchemist. While these days his work is bombastic and defined by larger-than-life set pieces, his approach back then was much more grounded, with an emphasis on intense choreography over anything else. One of the best examples of this is his scene of Edward versus Greed, a ludicrously well-animated fight that really demonstrates Nakamura's impressive understanding of weighty motion and visceral timing. It vividly extends across the multitude of pivotal scenes this man produced for the series, but it's not just exclusive to action. This man is capable of drawing the most horrifying sequences of morphing entities or fully realized dynamic environments. He's truly an animator with such a multifaceted skill set that it's honestly no surprise to see why he's become such a pillar of the industry after 20 years of refining these skills year by year. Perhaps one of his more interesting feats on this series comes from the show's fourth opening that he directed, boarded and supervised. While it features a whole host of different animators, the chorus in particular really demonstrates his touch so well. The way the camera dances from character to character is just so fucking good. But of course, Nakamura can't animate every action scene, and thankfully the show wasn't strapped for another star. Norimitsu Suzuki, another terrific animator that, although may not be quite on Nakamura's level at this stage in his career, has since gone on to produce some absolutely ludicrous scenes also. How do you even begin to animate backgrounds in vehicles like that? It's out of this world. But that's not to say that Suzuki wasn't producing some great scenes for this show also. He very much was, but with a very different emphasis than Nakamura's action. Suzuki is a great character animator, by which I mean he's incredible at drawing delicate movements, really bringing to life scenes that aren't action necessarily. And this is no truer than in every ending animation this series has. Yeah, you heard me right. Suzuki solo animated every single ending animation the 2003 series has, and they are so damn good. They really showcase that actually he can do action super well, even if that's not where his emphasis was in the episodes themselves all the time. But I mean, he helped Nakamura during the Greed fight and kicked ass with Ed versus Multiform Envy. So he wasn't exactly totally locked into just endings either. This isn't to say the 2003 anime was carried by only 2 people either, by the way. There are absolutely other great scenes from one-off animators dotted throughout, but Suzuki and Nakamura's work are definitely the 2 I think most fans consciously or otherwise think of when it comes to this series. The show really is a tremendous landmark of its time, and so it's crazy to think that Brotherhood then came along and totally eclipsed its production quality with one of the best looking anime of all time. Where 2003's anime had Yutaka Nakamura, Brotherhood had Yoshimichi Kameda, an iconic figure whose work is completely inseparable from the heights of this series. Kameda is certainly no stranger to those of you who have watched my Mob Psycho review. Kameda was the character designer there and really brought the series to life through his trademark brushstroke style. It's an approach that can be found in his incredible One Punch Man animations too, but its birth and usage that made it so defining is all down to Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood. It's really no exaggeration to say you could do a 20-minute video on Kameda's Fullmetal Alchemist work alone. It is genuinely breathtaking in every sense of the word. Greed vs. Bradley is a powerhouse of snappy timing and crazy layouts. I mean, look at the way he draws Greed's coat at the start of this like it's some sort of crazed bat creature. Or the way he flourishes Bradley's face with awesome brushstrokes. Or even the last cut where he just throws away traditionally painted backgrounds and animates the entire room himself. Like, what a madman. And that's just one scene. Mustang absolutely roasting the ever-loving crap out of Envy has got to be one of the most iconic scenes in anime history. Kameda just lets loose with the most insane fire shapes, topped off with his now iconic brushstrokes drenching the scene with unparalleled energy. I mean, he really just never stops firing on all cylinders across the entire production. Bradley vs. Scar is another one of those scenes of pure unfiltered madness. It's all just so dynamic, and when you look at Arikawa's panels for Mustang vs. Lust, it really just feels like they were drawn with the express purpose of Kameda bringing them to life. For all intents and purposes, Kameda is Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood, and you can almost guarantee that all of your favorite moments likely come from him, whether it's episode content or opening and ending contributions. If you see inky brushstrokes, it is more than likely his work. But as we know, shows aren't really made by one person alone, and Brotherhood most definitely has another huge player in its lineup. Hironori Tanaka's contributions to this series are beyond comprehension. His output in the industry across the years of 2008 and 2009 have got to be the highest workload to ratio ever seen by an animator. On Brotherhood alone, this man was constantly putting out multi-minute long sequences of absurd quality. When you consider most animators are putting out 10 to 20 second long scenes per episode, and this man is producing upwards of 3 minutes worth of non-stop movement all by himself, I mean, that kind of speaks to just how insanely talented this guy is, right? His work is defined by a few aspects. Most critically, it's the wispy effect and thin line work. There's something about it that just feels so effortless in spite of its insane complexity. He also likes to draw on ones a lot, which means that every frame within a second is a unique drawing, which leads to a level of fluidity rarely found in anime. He's a real multi-talented animator who not only excels in human action, but draws the most random stuff so well. Like, look at this panda sneezing and then the kids running across the screen. It's all animated so well, and who teaches this? Like, he didn't learn this in school. He can just do this. This is the kind of animator Tanaka is. He gives it his all no matter what's put in front of him. And his presence on this series alongside Kameda is a real key factor in its position as one of the all-time greats. Additionally, Brotherhood was truly blessed with a fantastic array of guest animators too. Ryo Timo, a young web animator, produced one hell of a sequence with Ling, for example. There was also Takashi Kojima, who many will know from One Piece these days, who dropped in for a short but awesome scene. Heck, there's Ken Otsuka, a legendary mecha animator and big Dragon Ball fan, who popped up for another amazing fight. It really cannot be overstated just how stacked Brotherhood's production was. Even if you put aside the sheer quality of its storytelling, its music, and its direction, just the quality of its animation alone could have it sit firmly on top of all the best anime lists. Fullmetal Alchemist, whether it's the 2003 adaptation or its latest Brotherhood take, are some of anime's finest productions, and what a thrill it was to learn that a manga I have enjoyed so much was blessed with two impressive feats of anime. It's really no wonder you guys have been yelling at each other about which one's best for over a decade now. They're both so good.
Fullmetal Alchemist.
So, remember when I said that I knew things were going too well and that things were about to go bad again real quick? Well, I didn't realize just how quickly that would happen, and this sudden shift hit me in waves. First of all, it was like, who's that doctor dude? Oh, he did what? Damn, that's bad. Then he sends them away with a transmutation circle, double damn. Then they appear in front of Daddy, triple damn, and Hoenheim is inside of him.
Oh, kinky.
Won't somebody please think of the children?
I think it's important to point out at this juncture why I think this story becomes ultimately as successful as it does. Sticking a landing for a story, no matter its length, is a difficult task. It just so happens that the longer the yarn is spun, or story in this case, the more complicated it ultimately runs the risk of being towards the end. George R.R. Martin, famous for writing the Song of Ice and Fire book series, and of course the series Game of Thrones was based off of, is experiencing that right now. And the TV show suffered immensely as a direct result. The first 5 or so seasons of the TV show were directly based off of the original work, as George had, up until then, written 5 books. And upon the release of the first season of Game of Thrones, he had already been working on the 6th and penultimate edition in this series entitled The Winds of Winter. However, that book has been a work in progress for almost, and I kid you not, 12 years. This is, of course, conjecture, as I'm not spoken to George myself or heard him talk about this struggle in much detail, but it seems to me that he continued to expand his world further and further into the books that have been released beyond what had originally initially been planned for. And this approach is honestly fine, or at least it is in theory. You see, the trouble arises when you establish all of these plot lines and then you inevitably need to orchestrate a way for them to return and meet at a resolution, oftentimes meeting in a singular point. Now, with that said, I hope I'm wrong and that George can indeed finish the 6th and 7th books in a timely fashion, but I'm not going to hold out much hope there. But my point is less about the specific writing process itself and more the nature of stories as a whole. There is a reason that most anime you will come across are usually separated into arcs. Constructing a congruent story with adequate setup, payoff, characters, and themes for even a smaller story like that is immensely difficult. But what Fullmetal Alchemist shoots for is much higher than that. It is a single, continuous story that juggles a dozen handfuls of balls in the air all at once. And with each passing volume I finished, as I progressed through this series, I wondered more and more how she could possibly stick the landing with such a lofty affair. But the fact remains, she did. Arikawa manages to not lose sight of her finish line the whole way through, and makes sure to deliver those payoffs where she can as best as possible. But maybe what's most remarkable is that, while there is clearly a lot of thought put into this series regarding its scene structure, dialogue, and characters, I can't say this story does anything in its ending that is revolutionary. And I love that. She keeps it simple because she already knows she's won us over as fans at this point. There's no need to re-engineer the wheel or do something pretentious or subversive at this point, because she knows that sometimes sacrifice, lessons being learned, and closure is a great ending in and of itself. And this story deserves that sort of an ending. Like, What happens with Mustang being thrown into a portal of truth against his will to create a sacrifice was a cool idea, but it was hinged on a rather simple concept, demonstrating how Mustang himself had grown ethically as a human being. He wasn't going to throw his humanity away thanks to Hawkeye, or even Al, for instance. Once again, just like Ed was tested at numerous points in the story, Al had the chance to get his body back, but upon realizing he'd be more useful to his brother and friends as he currently is, he has to pass up this once-in-a-multi-year journey opportunity. This entire story is a congregation of simple ideas built on a foundation of compelling and also simple themes that in isolation aren't mind-blowing, but because Arakawa was mindful, she never got confused and was able to paint a very long story, tying all of these kinds of narrative tricks together. And now we find ourselves in a very cathartic spot, ready to witness
the Day of Reckoning.
At this point, I'm thinking to myself, this is awesome, but how the hell is there still 2 volumes left to read? Like, this feels like the last scene. But before I give all my focus to the big final fight, I want to say that I love Scar's full circle moment here, where he surprises Wrath and all of us at home by revealing new markings on his opposite arm, allowing him to reconstruct in addition to deconstruct. It's awesome, and while I never learn his name, in the end it really didn't matter because at this point in the story he's an entirely different person. But that's just one side of that fight, and with Wrath, Arakawa added a really cute piece of foreshadowing. If you read this page, you'll see a shot of Wrath looking at the sun, commenting on the fact that it's not God but the hand of man that they must be wary of. And when we cut back to right now, in this scene, we have the hand of man, Scar, seeing to Wrath's end while he looks at the eclipse. It's a really nice touch, and while I love this, it's far from my favorite part. This is a small detail, but the story would be so much less without it. It's obvious that what Mustang did by denying Pride and the Doctor's wishes to open the portal to bring Hawkeye back was a good, morally sound decision, but what's more is, it seems that because Pride had to force Mustang to open the portal, he, in addition to Mustang losing his eyesight, had something taken from him too. And so, that choice Mustang made still has helped the hero's side despite their current circumstances. It's a lovely metaphor for real life that while doing the right thing might not benefit you initially or directly, there's a net positive outcome that otherwise wouldn't have been there had you taken the other more morally dubious route. And on the back of that, I just love how Edward applies logic to deduce that Pride must too be weakened because of the portal. And in my mind I was thinking, I wonder if Pride is using his regenerative abilities over and over to retain his current self, to not let on. It's a really interesting set of circumstances and a brilliant way to weaken what has been up until now a homunculi that was far too powerful to deal with before. Greed is the best character in the series, and I don't want to hear anything about how cool Mustang is, or how noble and funny Edward is, or how endearing Al is. Greed is the only acceptable answer here. Even though this was a trap ultimately set up by his creator to get him out of the way and to aid his plan, it's far from the last meaningful contribution he's going to make to the story. For this might be my favorite part of the big finish. I alluded earlier to the fact that Greed doesn't talk down to his subordinates and in fact shows them more respect than even the hero of this story does. And as the fight progresses, we see more and more just what sorts of wants he's been denying himself, trying to fill what he believed was a bottomless void of greed, only to discover something far more conventional before he meets his demise. But enough blabbering, I'll get to that later. It's time. After over 100 chapters of mystery and build-up, we finally arrive at the true plan of the homunculi and Daddy. Not just a countrywide Philosopher's Stone, but harnessing that power to entrap God itself inside Daddy's body. And man, this entire sequence really delivers big on that whole bad things are coming soon business I alluded to earlier. 100 chapters of adventure, character growth, pain and triumph, all in service of stopping whatever this dwarf in a bottle was planning. And then they fail. Daddy knew the inner workings of his pawns too well, to the point of knowing how to get Greed himself in the exact position needed to complete the process. And what follows is nearly an entire chapter of watching on as an entire country is erased from existence. Throughout this entire story, Arakawa has done incredible work in playing with the concept of information. In literature, the idea of the reader knowing more than the characters is very common. It's called dramatic irony, and it's often used to great effect, even within Fullmetal Alchemist. But what Arakawa manages to make use of so very often in this story is, well, almost the exact opposite of dramatic irony. She seems to revel in having events occur that the reader is not expected to understand in the slightest at the time. It's more than foreshadowing, it's outright toying with the reader's knowledge of the events taking place, making them feel completely lost and, in this moment, helpless. This sort of literary concept has been used by Arakawa from the get-go too, even as far back as the initial events of Dr. Marco being ambushed by Lust. Time and time again, we have been thrust into parts of the world that, at the time, we are not informed of in the slightest, and the revelation of these events are left to the forces of time and hindsight. The final sequence of events regarding Daddy's grand plan is the largest culmination of this approach in this story. We watch in horror as this process unfolds, and over the course of a single chapter, dozens of bits of foreshadowing and reverse dramatic irony all come folding in on itself. Suddenly, so much of it now makes sense. The Amestris transmutation circle, the importance of Al abandoning his body, the gathering of the human sacrifices, it all falls in on this singular, unseen objective of absorbing God itself. And what makes this revelation and approach double effective and smart, for me at least, is that it helps to place us in the shoes of the main characters. If you think back, these two characters, Al and Edward, are not just the main characters, there are full-on points of view. What they know, we know, and we understand this world and as much of this world as they seem to know. And while the story being told is one part action, the other part is mystery. And so it was a terrific choice, I think, to have every revelation be as effective for us as it is to the main duo themselves. And as I read in horror while the unthinkable was happening before me, there was one major piece of foreshadowing left to play off. One element in this giant chess game that had gone yet unaccounted for. Hoenheim. His trips around the land of Amestris, which before had served only as moments of titillation around the mystery of this character, come surging to relevance as it is revealed that Ho-Ho himself had been assembling a contingency for this all along. A contingency that Daddy did not plan for at all. I find it really interesting that the resolution to this doomsday plan comes not only in the form of paying off previous foreshadowing, but chiefly as a medium of ideological positing. The solution to this giant power struggle doesn't come in the form of who is the strongest or even who planned the most thoroughly. It is a fundamental deconstruction of the homunculus plan at its core, that maintaining the sanctity and order of life is far easier than ripping it away. Daddy was so very sure that the 50 million souls in his theoretical battery would more than suffice against Ho-Ho's messy 500,000. But none of that matters, because as Ho-Ho reveals to both Daddy and simultaneously us as readers, the soul and body are intimately connected. Removing that soul by force is considerably more difficult than reuniting them. And in hindsight, we have seen this at play so many times in the story before. Barry the Chopper being drawn to his body, the Chimeras, or even Al being nearly dragged by force to his body in recent chapters. The two entities are drawn together like magnets, and all it took was Ho-Ho's planning and 500,000 ancient souls, the shadow of a solar eclipse, and decades of study to bring the 50 million magnets colliding back together. Man, what an incredible payoff! It is really hard for this entire video to not be just one big Fullmetal Alchemist payoffs compilation, but this story really does manage to resolve its threads that satisfyingly. And along that very vein, we finally get to see the true result of Scar and his brother's efforts. And I have to admit, like many of the other reveals that happen in these final chapters, I almost feel stupid in hindsight. Not thinking of using the Continental Transmutation Circle as a base for a Purification Circle feels so obvious now that I think about it, and as Scar opens the theoretical tap, giving the heroes a nearly unlimited supply of power, the real final fight begins. Not just to take down Daddy, but to resolve all of the remaining problems in a way that is ethical. And that's the key. How do you take out Pride without murdering him? How do you take out Daddy without harming others? How do you get Ed and Al's bodies back without resorting to the tainted Philosopher's Stones? As the entire cast charges at Daddy with nearly unlimited power now, it feels like a frantic rush to pop the balloon that is him. Everyone is giving it their all to bring Daddy to his knees. Even Greed, who, hey, he calls him Daddy too. What did I tell you? Greed is just the best. Anyways, this final push to the end of the finish line really is all out. You've got Daddy retreating to the surface to try to acquire more Philosopher's Stone, him setting off a small nuke worth of power just to make a point, the army shooting its entire firepower at Daddy just to hold him off for a second, Ronald McDonald Mustang showing up with a Hawkeye as his seeing eye hawk, Greed tricking Daddy into leaving an opening by luring him in with his Philosopher's Stone, Edward having his arm completely obliterated. There is just so much that happens in this final sprint that is impossible to cover in full detail without talking for at least 3 more hours, and I'm not willing to do that. But one thing I can say for certain is that the energy and desperation of this sequence shines through completely clear as a viewer and as a reader. With every single rapid-fire turn of events, I felt more and more tense reading through this gigantic affair. And then my heart stopped, because I could see plain as day that Edward had permanently lost use of both of his arms. And I know that when Al starts talking about using equivalent exchange to sacrifice himself for Ed's arm, I know that Arakawa is capable of going through with it. This entire final fight has, at least in part, been about the sacrifices the characters endure to meet their end goal. What is lost and what is gained as a result. Bradley is taken down, but at the cost of beloved characters. Mustang loses his eyes, rendering his incredible power almost entirely useless. And as I read Al's words, I knew in my heart that his sacrifice for this cause would be seen to fruition. And while it indeed did, it certainly wasn't in vain. Ed, now with 2 arms and a deep rage at the seeming loss of his brother, absolutely tears Daddy apart. After several dozen characters helped pull their weight in weakening him, Ed is finally able to pick himself up and take this man apart, and it is so cathartic to read through. We even get an amazing callback to the very first chapter of this story, as Ed once again declares, "Get up, you third-rate fraud. I'll show you there's no comparison between us." Even still, the sacrifices for this battle are not over. As Daddy finally begins to pop, he lunges for Greed in a final attempt to sustain his power. And over the course of the next few pages, a genuinely heart-wrenching conversation takes place between Greed and Lynn, one in which Greed is finally able to come to terms with what it is he sought the most from in life. Not wealth, not power, not even God himself, but friends. He abandons Lynn, or in reality saves him, and willingly sacrifices himself inside Daddy to further weaken him, for the sake of his friends. And I will say it one last time, I love Greed. It is so crazy to me that this seemingly one-note enemy we encountered briefly near the beginning of this story has managed to establish such a strong place in the heart of its viewers. And the funny thing is, looking back, it's not even really that Greed has changed all that much. This isn't a Zuko or Vegeta type situation where the bad guy slowly learns the error of his ways and transforms to a life of brewing tea for orphanages. I mean, the Greed we get in the final volume is really not all that different to the Greed we initially met. If anything, it's more us as viewers that have changed. We were given time to be with this person, become acquainted with their character traits and flaws, their own personal struggles, and watch as they slowly accepted who they were at their core. And with that final act of rebellion, he leaves us with his nearly final words of, "Oh, come on, don't do this to me, man." All that's left is a brittle husk of a dwarf with a newly installed hole in his cold chest. But as Daddy dissipates away, being sucked back into the chambers of God where he came from, the biggest conflict of all still isn't resolved, is it? Al is gone, and Ed still refuses to use the Philosopher's Stone to bring back Al. He even turns down Ho-Ho's offer to be the toll to get Al back. So what solution does Ed come up with in the end? Well, he gives up his portal of truth, his ability to perform alchemy altogether. And that toll might be the hardest possible outcome to accept here. It is the nature of these kinds of stories, the nature of shonen itself, to grow attached to not just the characters, but to their progression of power. We feel a bond to their progress and strength just as they do. We watch as these characters struggle, train, overcome mountains, achieve triumphs, and sacrifice themselves in service of that progress. So to see all of that evaporate away in a single moment, well, I think it might be harder to swallow than Ed dying himself. But similar to Greed at his end, Ed doesn't seem particularly upset with this toll. Despite everything he's been through, it becomes clear that Ed's incredible alchemy skills were never even the point to him. They were just a means to an end, a way to protect his friends as he marched towards his goal of bringing Al back. And that's it. That's the climax of this entire, long, wonderful story. All that remains is some falling action and resolution about the sacrifices that the characters made in this final battle. Mustang accepts the help of the Philosopher's Stone in order to regain his eyesight and help lead the land. Scar is healed and accepts his place in this new world. We even finally get the touching scene of Winry crying tears of joy as she sees Ed and Al whole again. Not a single character is left unresolved or unsatisfied, but in truth, the main point of this falling action that left the largest impact on me is likely the single most incredible page turn of this entire manga. With Ed on the roof of a house, complaining about how he wouldn't even need to climb up here to fix the roof if he'd still had alchemy, we turn the page to reveal an absolutely breathtaking and rare 2-page landscape shot before him. And Ed saying to himself, well, I guess hard work isn't always such a bad thing. I teared up when I read that. It's such a succinct and wonderfully fantastic metaphor for the themes and motifs at the heart of this entire story. This adventure I went on, all 108 chapters of it, each one of them served a purpose. Not a moment of these characters' time was wasted. Every friend they made, hardship they endured, obstacle they overcame, they all served a purpose in helping progress the world in a better direction. And they sure as hell weren't all easy, but that didn't stop Ed or Al, and the message of the story is, it shouldn't stop any of us. This has been a story I've wanted to cover for years. And like I said at the beginning, this has been sitting behind me, patiently waiting to be read all of this time. After all these years, after reading literally hundreds of volumes of manga, both in my leisure and on this channel, more and more it's becoming difficult to ignore a certain level of pressure and responsibility that comes with covering a story like this, one that touches the hearts and minds of literally millions of people across the world. And for those people, those fans of this story, I never want to leave those people down. And in response to that pressure, my natural instinct is to throw myself more into my work. And with this, I absolutely did that. Across 4 different videos and almost 3 hours worth of material, myself and my team have tried to, as best we can, pour our hearts and souls into this review for all of you out there to enjoy. It almost feels appropriate to call this equivalent exchange. What you get out of this is exactly what we put into it. But I'm also trying to deal with the rather unhealthy relationship I have with my work. I think to myself, maybe if I tirelessly work, people won't be disappointed. That's a feeling I try to ignore in the back of my head during every single video I've ever written. Sometimes I succeed and make something awesome, and sometimes I don't. And, I have to roll with those punches too. And while I still felt that same pressure during this review series, when I turned that page to Ed patching that roof, I surprised myself with my reaction to it. I teared up. I literally teared up. Never has a manga delivered for me something I never knew I needed like that. And it's not like I shouldn't have seen this coming. This story is, after all, about perspective at the end of the day. 3 hours of time I've dedicated to dissecting and expressing my thoughts on your favorite story in this, and it's difficult. But man, was this wonderful to read. So, to close things off with this video, I'll leave you with this. It was hard work reviewing this series, but I guess hard work isn't always such a bad thing. Thanks for watching.